Let's come back from the lunch break, please. It's 1 o'clock. When we broke for lunch, Namoga had completed its questioning. We move now to IPA A&M. Mr. Cludio.
Good morning, Madam Hearing Officer and members of the Commission. My name is Ann Tripp. Mr. Alexander, I'm with IPA&M, and I'll be the one examining you. And so I'm going to, Ms. Apataka already granted me permission. I'm just going to, I'll save that for a bit though. So before we went on break, Mr. Alexander, there was a question about the effect of these proposed rules on operators. And I apologize, I don't have a court reporter to look back on, but I believe, you agreed that there would be some effect on small operators. My follow-up question to that is, what about the responsible operators who are already plugging their own wells? What effect would the increases in financial assurances have on them?
Well, good for them if they're doing that and they're conducting their operations prudently. I don't have any specific analysis on that.
Well, you would agree under the proposed rule for marginal wells, financial assurance of $150,000 is required for each marginal well. Is that correct?
It'll have an effect, yes.
So for an operator with 100 marginal wells, they're looking at an increased financial assurance bonding requirement of 15 million.
Well, I'm gonna let me be clear. I'm not the expert in financial assurance. That's our next expert witness. I'm not going to do the math on this because I'm not qualified to do that.
Yes, sir. And I can understand that, but you're here to testify about in your operational experience. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And so in your operational experience, would an additional capital expenditure of 15 million have an effect on a small operator?
It would.
Could it potentially put a small operator out of business?
Depends on the financial resources of that small operator.
Mr. Alexander, I believe you testified earlier that you spent half your career with small operators.
Mm-hmm.
So in your own experience in those small operating companies, which were not in New Mexico, would an additional price tag of 15 million have had an effect on your operations for those companies?
Yes. Yeah.
Yes.
We had nowhere near those kinds of FA requirements.
And in what state was that, sir?
Well, I've operated in Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Wyoming, Nebraska, Colorado.
And it's your testimony today that there was nowhere near financial assurance requirements of $150,000 per well at that time.
No. It also didn't cost what it's costing now to plug a well.
Yes, sir. And we'll talk about plugging costs of well a little bit later. So you agree that there'll be an effect from this rule on responsible operators as well as those bad actors, which you intend to target. But what about the effect on an operator who's plugging his own wells but has already posted that financial assurance? Are you familiar with that process?
No, I'm not.
Would you disagree that have you reviewed the statutes and the regulations for financial assurance?
Not closely. Again, I am not the expert on that. Those questions are better directed at our next witness.
Mr. Alexander, I'm not asking about the overarching economic effects. I'm asking about an operator who has to post a $150,000 bond and then plug that well before the $150,000 bond is accessible or returned. Is that correct?
I'm not sure. Say that question again.
Yes. So under the current regulatory scheme
Right.
and statutory requirements,
Which I have reviewed.
financial assurance is required to be posted for wells, either in a blanket bonding form, or a one well plugging. Is that correct?
Right.
And the financial assurance, that requirement is tied to the plugging and abandonment of the well. Is that right?
Yes.
And so a financial assurance, that bond is not released until the well is plugged. Is that correct?
I believe that's true.
And so if an operator is required to post this additional, let's say 15 million in financial assurance, those funds are not returned to the operator until they've already had to pay out of pocket to plug the well for which that financial assurance is tied to.
Yes.
Yes. And so aside from small operators, do you see an effect on any other operators in New Mexico from the bonding rules?
I haven't analyzed it specifically, but I'm sure it will have some effect.
Well, in your testimony, you do offer some experience in the cycle of the industry. Is that an accurate summary?
That is accurate.
And in the cycle of the industry, wells pass from one operator to another, typically
Correct.
from larger to smaller.
Correct.
And so if small operators exit New Mexico because of these financial assurance requirements, who will take over those wells from the larger operators?
Depends on how they exit. If they walk away from it, then OCD will have to take on that operational responsibility and plug the wells.
Well, let's back that hypothetical up a few steps. So if the larger operators typically transfer wells to smaller operators that can run a well more efficiently with leaner operations, less administrative overhead, if smaller operators aren't there to take on those wells, would this rule affect larger operators?
Objection, speculation.
Yeah, it does invite speculation, Ms. Tripp.
Let's start. We can move on. So in your opinion, Mr. Alexander, will the financial assurance rules affect all operators within New Mexico?
Potentially, I guess.
Mr. Alexander, were you involved in the drafting or proposal of House Bill 133?
No,
And so you didn't participate in any of the stakeholder meetings or any of the proposed
I
legislation?
did not.
So in your testimony, you mentioned that you reviewed regulations from many of the 15 producing states. Is that right?
I looked at, and I've got a list of them here. There was an intern, I believe, that worked for Welk, did actually went out and grabbed some of the major provisions in upwards of 15 different states and how they deal with idle wells. And I read through that spreadsheet.
And did you review, I think earlier you just said you did review the New Mexico statutes and regulations as it pertains to bonding and idle wells and active wells.
Yes,
And I believe you've also testified before the Oil Conservation Commission before in prior rulemakings. Is that accurate?
I have.
And so you're familiar with the primary duties of the Oil Conservation Commission.
Vaguely, yes.
If I use the phrase to prevent waste and to protect correlative rights, is that familiar?
Yes, it is. It's like that in every state.
Okay, so in your experience as an operator, you're familiar with a definition of waste or a concept of waste.
The concept, yes.
And how would you define it?
Well, in combination with this idea of protecting correlative rights and, preserving the resources that the state has, the way I think about that and the way I've seen it done is that it's the duty of the OCC or OCD to make sure that oil and gas resources aren't wasted in the process of operations and or plugging and abandonment. Now, when that becomes, in that definition in its strictest terms, I believe there's a point at which, a well is done, you need to plug it. Is there still oil and gas in that reservoir? Yes, but it's not economic to recover it and to keep plugging at it and just keep hammering at it to get that last molecule out, I view as waste. Some may view that if you plug it, it's waste of oil and gas, but I view it as waste of an overall resource.
And what resource is wasted in that scenario?
Capital.
Capital is wasted in
Yeah.
that scenario.
Yeah, I mean, I can produce a well down to the last molecule and I might get $1 out of my efforts, but it might cost me $1,000 to do that. That's wasteful.
But in your preparation and in your opinion in this rulemaking, have you reviewed the statutory definition of waste?
No.
Okay. But you would, let me restate that. So you talked about economic waste, capital waste. Are there other forms of economic waste that you're familiar with?
Well, perhaps. I hadn't thought about it lately.
Well, would producing a well at low market or commodity prices, would that create economic waste?
Well, if I'm producing a well at a price for the commodity that is causing me to have a loss, I mean, why would I do that? That would be wasteful.
Thank you. And I would agree. And so to the extent that the marginal or the no beneficial use presumption carry production thresholds and those rules,
Yeah.
would you agree that there's an incentive to operators to produce wells to in excess of those limits, which would create economic waste?
I think so. If I'm understanding your question, or
My question is, there could be market conditions which would make it uneconomical to produce a well for
I
certain.
get that.
Okay.
Some people will shut a well in, but let's be careful about that. Am I to shut a well in and wait for the price of oil to go to $500? No, that's speculation. You know, you get a few dollars per barrel variance here, and if that's going to take a well from uneconomic to economic, you're in trouble already.
Mr. Alexander, are there any parts of the proposed amendments to the rules that take economic factors into analysis?
Let me think about that. Indirectly so, I would say.
And
You
in
know,
what
when you
indirect?
think about the presumption provisions that OCD provided and that we adopted, where you have 90 barrels of oil equivalent over 90 days and 12 consecutive months, there's an implied economic factor in that for sure.
So there's an implicit economic, but it is not expressly stated within the definition
I
of
don't
marginal well.
recall seeing that in the regulations.
Okay, thank you. Can premature plugging of wells also create waste? Waste in the sense of unrecovered hydrocarbons?
It depends on your definition of premature. It could. If the well was actually plugged and it shouldn't have been, then there is waste.
And so to the extent that a well is marginal, but could have another 15 to 20 years of production, if an operator couldn't afford a financial assurance of 15 million and plug that well, that would create waste. Is that correct?
I don't think so. If you can't operate the well economically, and that would include whatever the financial assurance provisions are and other operating expenses, it's done.
In your experience in other states,
Mhm.
is a financial assurance and the plugging cost, is that incorporated into a production and paying quantities analysis?
You know, it's been a while since I've been involved with operations to consider that sort of thing. I would say yes, but I don't have any direct recent experience with that.
Okay, thank you for that. And I think we touched on it briefly, but you also don't have any operational experience within the San Juan Basin or the Permian Basin. Is that
I
accurate?
do not.
And so you're not familiar with the geological formations or the Permian stack or the formations in the San Juan Basin?
Just, you know, mildly so.
And your experience in Arkansas, that was in the Fayetteville Shale development, is that accurate?
That was part of it. When I joined the company, we had production in the fairway. It was all conventional production.
And what were the average depths of those wells?
In the fairway, probably anywhere between 45 and, 6,500, something like that. In the Fayetteville Shale, the TVD would be, in that 5,000 or so foot range on average before you kicked off, and our laterals would cause our measured depths to be upwards of 10,000 feet.
And that experience was with Southwestern Energy, is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And is Southwestern Energy still in Arkansas?
They are not.
Did they plug and abandon each of their wells before leaving the state?
No, they sold them.
And they sold them to a smaller operator?
Yeah, the Fayetteville Shale was sold, I believe, to Flywheel. I don't know anything about them. I really forget who we sold all of our conventional production to.
Do you have any knowledge about whether that had an effect on the local economy or the communities and around that area of Arkansas?
When we sold the conventional production, it really didn't have any impact whatsoever. The operator was a as far as I know, a good operator. And like I said, I don't know anything about flywheel. The community experienced great positive things from our development of the federal shale. And when the drilling essentially stopped and we had drilled about everything that was going to be economic, then, a lot of those opportunities kind of slid away. But I have no direct experience of how things have gone. I think it was sold in 2018, something like that, and I haven't kept up with that.
Do you have any operating experience as a stripper well operator?
I've operated wells that are in that category as stripper. Yeah. I wouldn't say that our companies were called stripper well operators.
But you're familiar with the life cycle of primary production moving to secondary or tertiary recovery,
I am.
and that there's a substantial percentage of hydrocarbons that can be recovered either in that secondary or tertiary phase.
Absolutely.
Have you put together any of those projects before?
No.
Oh, so you're not aware of how long it takes to create a secondary recovery unit?
Well, I'm aware. I'm aware it takes a long time to develop those projects. As a matter of fact, my wife used to work for Shell and was involved with a lot of those projects early on.
And just developing is that inclusive of the permitting process?
Everything. It's very complicated. Unitization can take forever. I get that.
In
And I
terms
don't
of,
think these regulations are meant to interrupt that process either.
and the which part of the regulations would affect those processes?
Well, this idea that if we have to come up with, with reasons that a well should or should not be T&A'd or P&A'd and whatnot, there are, as we said, all of these presumptions are rebuttable. And if there are future uses, or if an EOR project is taking this long to develop, and nobody's here to try and say, no, you've taken too long, that's enough, we're out of here.
And in the proposed rules, while beneficial use and temporary abandonment have these exceptions or these rebuttable opportunities, marginal well does not. Is that correct?
I don't think that'd be the case.
Or would you disagree?
I think, well, go ahead and answer the question.
My only question is that the definition of marginal well sets an arbitrary threshold of days of production and barrels of oil equivalent per year. Is that an accurate summary of the rule?
Oh, well, the presumption of beneficial use is a class of inactive wells, and they are within the marginal well category. So yes.
That's a fair clarification. So to the extent that no beneficial use wells are included in marginal wells, there is an exception to appeal that determination. But within the range of greater than 90 BOE, less than 1,000 BOE, is there any appeal opportunity or determination of economics of a well?
I'm not specifically aware of that, but I can't believe that it is not available. There's always an appeal process. And OCD is going to have a presumption of no beneficial use based on that threshold that we have presented of 90 barrels of oil equivalent over 90 days within a 12-month consecutive period. That beyond that, I don't think that OCD is going to be issuing orders to review wells that are above that threshold.
I would agree, Mr. Alexander, under the proposed rules, but the proposed rules set a financial assurance requirement for all marginal wells. Is that right?
I believe that's true.
And there is no exception for marginal wells. In other words, for a well that's producing less than 180 days and less than 1,000 BOE for an operator to appeal that determination of financial assurance that's required.
I don't know about that. I didn't get involved with the marginal well category. That's our next witness.
And
I
so
was more involved with the 90, and 12 months of inactive wells.
thank you, sir. We'll reserve those questions and for Mr. Purvis. In your experience as an operator and operating expenses, do you have familiarity with distinguishing between capital expenses and operating expenses?
Oh, fairly.
Did you have a chance to review any of the testimony from the division's witnesses?
I did not
Okay.
read their testimony.
But you would agree that there's a distinction in the way an operator would treat a monthly lease operating expense
Oh, yes.
as opposed
Yeah, yeah.
to a capital
Oh, yeah,
expenditure.
absolutely.
Be careful not to speak on the end of each other's sentences.
Okay, sorry.
Thank you, ma'am. And so there are some parts of your testimony where you mentioned the reclamation fund. Do you recall those areas?
Not really. No, I don't.
Are you familiar with what the reclamation fund is?
Basically,
Um,
but I don't know anything specifically about it.
But you did state that the reclamation fund could be used for other purposes or other programs.
I don't recall saying that. Maybe I did, but I don't recall that. In my direct testimony,
In your direct testimony, sir, do you have a copy of it or would you like me to pull it
I
up?
do. Tell me what page.
I believe it's page 17, footnote 3.
What line?
I believe it's a footnote 3 at the bottom of the page. It continues from page 17 to page 18.
Yeah, okay, I get it. I see it.
And so you state that I understand in New Mexico, the reclamation fund is funded through a tax on oil and gas operations. However, that public money spent on plugging and abandoning wells of operators that have abandoned their responsibilities could have been spent on other worthy and necessary public programs.
Okay, okay.
I read that correctly?
Yeah.
Okay. And so the other public programs, but you've not reviewed the statute which creates the reclamation fund.
No,
And so you're not aware of whether the reclamation fund is actually limited or constrained to specific purposes.
I am not.
And when you say throughout your testimony about the effect of orphaned or the state having to plug and abandon wells and the effect on that on the taxpayer, you're not referring to taxpayers providing any portion of that reclamation fund, are you?
Well, one way or the other, the taxpayers pay. Even if it comes from Washington DC, you're paying for it. It hits the individual taxpayer one way or another. And no, I'm not saying that the taxpayer's out here at the steps writing a check. I don't say that at all. But the money doesn't come from out of the sky that nobody has any no control over. It's coming out of your pocket one way or the other.
Are you familiar with the oil and gas conservation tax?
And not really.
Yes, sir. Well, I'll offer to you that the oil and gas conservation tax is one of the only contributions into the reclamation fund, which is paid by industry.
And
Objection, testimony? That wasn't a question.
All right. Do you have a question to follow up on that, Ms. Tripp?
Yes, Madam Hearing Officer. So just to restate, Mr. Alexander, you've not reviewed any of the reclamation fund statute. Is that
I
correct?
have not.
And so you're not aware of how the oil and gas conservation tax contributes to the reclamation fund.
Not specifically.
Okay, we'll move on. So there were several exhibits that were referenced today and throughout your testimony. Exhibit 7 is the inactive well list, and I can display that for the commissioners just a second. And I don't know that I can expand it large enough that it's
Oh, that's fine.
going to be helpful.
I can see it.
And so I just wanted to ask a couple follow-up questions about how this exhibit was created. And so did you compile these numbers?
I did not. There's a employee of Environmental Defense Fund that pulled this information together from OCD data.
And so you're not aware of how they actually created the chart in terms of what data was used or what data set?
Well, it would be the status of wells that is kept by OCD.
Yes, sir.
It came from OCD data and it was compiled in this chart.
And was there a certain Is there a certain data set you're aware of? OCD maintains a lot of data, New Mexico Tech maintains a lot of data.
I don't know the name of the data set, but it would be their inactive well list is what I would call it.
And then are you aware if these numbers of wells include federal, state, and fee wells in New Mexico?
I believe we stayed away from federal wells.
But you're not aware of any of the process in terms of how you would have excluded federal wells in creating this?
No, I didn't get involved with her pulling this list together, you know, the raw data.
And so you're not aware of, in terms of what category of inactive well, whether it's total approved TA wells on an active well search, total expired TA wells, or total wells under ACOI, the 287 Ridgeway, Arizona wells are included.
I don't know if those specific wells are included. No.
But you're familiar with the Ridgeway as an operator and the
Basically
settlement in New
familiar
Mexico.
with that, yes.
Sure. Okay. I also want to refer back to your direct testimony and the summary that you offered today. The phrase out of compliance was used repeatedly, and I want to clarify on that. When you use the term out of compliance, is there a specific regulation that you're referring to?
Well, with current regulations, you know, for example, that chart that you just put up there, there's inactive wells that are out of compliance. Yeah, those are the specific regulations. I have to go find them. But, you know, basically, you know, a well is inactive for a year, and then you have 90 days to either P&A the well or apply for TA. Okay, and then if you don't do either one of those, then it's out of compliance. And that's kind of the basic category there.
So
It
that,
just, and my point about that is that from OCD's discussions with us, operators have learned to game that system. So, for example, you shut a well in on January the 1st of any given year, or whatever date you shut it in, and 3-4 months later, you open it up for half a day, you burp up a barrel of oil, and then you shut it back in. And so in their minds, that's resetting that inactivity or inactive status clock. And it just goes on and on and on. And I presume that's the way a lot of these are. And that's not the way the rule is written. But those wells are out of compliance because they have not been applied for and put into TA or P&A.
thank you. And so just to put a bow on that, out of compliance is used with respect to specifically well activity in terms of temporary abandonment or active inactive status.
Yeah, yes.
It's not referring at all to environmental compliance or other notice of violation that
No,
the
no,
division may issue.
No, no, no.
Moving on to the beneficial use and purpose definition. We've already touched on whether speculative is defined, but just to recap, speculative is not a defined term under the current regulations or the proposed amendment.
It is not.
Okay. However, the oil and gas industry, there's many legitimate activities that occur which someone may call speculative. Is that a fair summary?
I guess it's a fair statement. It depends on, you know, an individual's risk aversion profile.
But you would agree that a speculative activity can be based on information. It's just that there is not a known outcome.
No, that's not where we're going with that. The outcome is independent of what we're talking about here. In the context of does not include speculative use, we went straight to the dictionary. And the dictionary calls it, you know, basically guesswork, and there's no information on it. Okay. So that's clearly different than said. I think you just said speculative use could be tied to something that with an unknown outcome. I mean, every well you drill has an unknown outcome. So is every well a speculative well? Of course not.
And then in the definition of beneficial use that's proposed, Were you aware that New Mexico adopted a well repurposing act?
Well, what?
Well repurposing act for carbon storage or other energy storage?
I'm not familiar with that act.
Okay.
But let's be clear. Remember those two words in that definition, such as. That opens the door to any viable use beyond production, injection, or monitoring, okay?
That's fair, but to the extent that operators rely on certainty and regulations, to the extent a regulation doesn't provide an exhaustive list and administrators are prone to change, there's uncertainty in that.
Well, I would disagree with that. If I see something like such as, or for example, to me, that opens the door to any viable use.
And energy capture or carbon storage would be one of those viable uses.
I would think so.
Earlier on the subject of temporary abandonment of wells, you testified that temporary abandonment is simply a subset of well. Is that correct?
Active wells.
A subset of inactive wells. And, but however, currently the regulations have two separate temporary abandonment definitions. Is that right?
Remind me of that.
Currently, there's temporary abandonment, and then there's a different category of well, approved temporary abandonment.
Yeah. Let me turn, hold on just a second here. Yeah. Approved temporary abandonment, we're adding to that temporary abandonment or temporarily abandoned status means the status. So we're adding to that definition of approved temporary abandonment.
But as it exists, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead, sir.
And getting rid of the temporary abandonment or temporarily abandoned status because TA does not equal necessarily inactive. It's a subset.
Is that a change in division interpretation?
I don't know the answer to that. I don't know how they interpreted TA versus inactive. You'd have to ask them.
But the current regulation states that a temporary abandoned well is an inactive well. Is that?
It is
that's not right.
inactive,
Yes, and under the
but an
regulation,
inactive well is not necessarily a temporarily abandoned well.
I understand that that's your opinion. I'm asking what the current regulation states for temporary abandonment.
It says it right here. Temporary abandonment or temporarily abandoned status means the status of a well that is inactive. And we're saying we don't think that's quite accurate.
Yes, and so you're proposing a change.
Get rid of that definition and go with the new definition that we're proposing.
Thank you. And so in your testimony, you also mentioned that financial assurances haven't changed in years in New Mexico. Do you recall that?
Could you cite the
Yeah, I
page
did.
number, please?
Sorry, what?
Could you cite the specific testimony, please?
Yes, I can grab that. I apologize. Page 16, line 18 to 19.
I see it.
Financial assurance levels have not been updated for years. Is that correct?
That's what it says.
And so what would,
Objection. It refers to state regulations, not specifically New Mexico.
You're right.
that's fair enough, Mr. Anders, or Mr. Alexander. When was the last time financial assurance levels were changed in New Mexico?
What's that, 2018, 19, somewhere? I don't remember specifically.
Were you involved in that rulemaking proceeding?
I was not.
And have you reviewed the transcript from that proceeding prior to this?
No.
Would it surprise you that the witness for OCD testified that a temporary abandoned well is an inactive well?
No, that would surprise me a bit. I would say the same thing. But what I said was an inactive well is not necessarily a temporarily abandoned well.
Which is a change that applicants are proposing
Exactly.
here.
Yeah, yeah.
So you referenced several times today that you spoke with OCD staff and some of the changes are based on OCD staff experience. Is that a correct summary?
Yes.
And in these changes, which include several exceptions or ability to rebut a presumption, did applicants analyze any of the administrative burden created by these rules?
No.
Is that something that you
Well,
spoke?
I didn't. Maybe someone else on staff did, but I did not.
Have you reviewed any testimony of any witnesses that addresses the administrative burden that would be created by these proposed rules?
No.
There's another concept that's referred to throughout your direct and rebuttal testimony, and that's of risk. And I want to ask a few questions about that. Because earlier we were told that everything had been data tested in terms of the testimony of the applicants. So how is risk determined for an orphan well?
In the context that we're talking about, it's a production level that, at least on the surface, there's a presumed idea that it's not making enough revenue from the production to cover the costs. And therefore, that well is potentially at risk of becoming a burden to the state and becoming an orphaned well.
And is that correlate to your experience with Southwestern, that you operated on a well by well basis?
Yeah, we evaluated all the companies that I worked with. We knew what each well was doing.
But there's a presumption built in to your concept of risk. You said that there's a presumption that the production levels will not support operation of the well. And I may be misstating it. I apologize if I am.
I'm not real sure what you're asking. I'm sorry.
Restate, please.
Are there presumptions or assumptions built into the concept of risk to which you testify?
Yes.
Would you disagree? Have you reviewed any of the testimony of IP&M witnesses or other New Mexico operators?
Some, yes.
You're aware that there is testimony from those operators that plugging costs typically come from production of new wells.
Well, if somebody said that, I don't remember seeing that, but it could be that. I don't really know how to respond to that question.
Is it your position that every well should be self-sufficient? In other words, there should be production sufficient to accomplish all expenses related to that well?
No.
Okay.
No, there are going to be certain situations where you're looking at a lease level, and that makes sense. And I think I made that statement. And that would be the type of information that an operator would come to OCD with and say, hey, we're not producing this well because it's going to be used for something else. And I get that.
Yes, sir. I think this question is slightly more specific in terms of whether the funds to plug a well must come from that well's production.
I've made no such statement.
Okay, so, and I just want to clarify that that's not your position.
No.
However, in your testimony at page 26, line 18 through 20, production thresholds to generate sufficient revenues in remaining lifespan to fund plugging and reclamation puts those wells at greater risk of being orphaned.
Mhm.
But it's your opinion today that a well doesn't need to be self-sufficient. In other words, the production threshold from a single well does not need to generate sufficient revenue to plug and reclaim that well.
Well, I'm making a statement that that's the case, but it's not necessarily where the monies are going to come from to plug that well.
Because an operator is generally operating more than just one well.
Generally.
And so an operator can plan in terms of setting a plugging and abandonment budget And an operator can also assign funds, either operating expenses or capital expenses, to accomplish that.
True. Yes.
Ms. Terpio, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Hearing Officer. And circling back to this idea of risk, did you undertake any independent analysis of orphan wells in terms of looking at the period of time of activity before they were deemed orphan by the Oil Conservation Division?
I didn't personally do that, no.
So is there any evidence that you're offering today that increasing financial assurance levels will address the risk of orphan wells?
I think earlier today I said there's no silver bullet that will take care of everything, but closing the gap between the current level of financial assurance that is required under the current set of regulations, we need to close that gap between that and reality. And I think that that situation is prevalent in every jurisdiction with oil and gas operations. Every state is struggling with this and recognizes that it's insufficient. As I said earlier in my testimony today, otherwise we wouldn't have over 800,000 wells in this nation that are orphaned. That came about because the regulations aren't sufficient, they weren't enforced, and operators didn't pay attention to their business.
But it's not your opinion today that all operators in New Mexico are acting imprudently.
Oh, no, of course not.
And
course.
you would agree that 95% of the wells in the state are plugged by operators.
I think that's accurate. You know, earlier I said that the OCD is in the last 10 years or so plugged, or 20 years plugged 1,000 wells, which represents about 5% of the total wells plugged. If that relationship, I think that's about right.
And in terms of whether operators want to maintain the status quo or not, you mentioned that you reviewed some of the witness testimony from New Mexico operators. And there were suggestions regarding alternate uses of the reclamation fund or election of the conservation tax. Did you review any of those portions?
I don't recall that.
Would you agree or disagree with the statement that New Mexico should produce less oil and gas, not more?
If it can produce more, that's great. I'm not here to try and shut down the oil and gas industry. And I don't think any of us are.
But you would agree there could be a significant effect on small operators by increasing financial assurance levels.
Yes, but I can also tell you that based on some of the charts that we've thrown up there, the amount of production that it would have an impact on in this state is insignificant. 0.003%, I think, is in that group of wells in that 90 barrels of oil equivalent, 90 days, 12 consecutive months. So it's an insignificant amount of oil.
Yes, sir. But that level, that 0.003% is referring to wells without a presumption of beneficial use. That's not referring to the category of marginal wells. Is
No,
that
no,
accurate?
That's correct. That's true.
Thank you. My final question, if I have time for it, your Exhibit 12 refers to a collection or a sampling of C-103s for temporary abandoned wells.
Mhm.
Are you familiar? At any point, did you or an intern follow up on the status of those wells
No.
that are TA?
No, didn't. No.
So you're not aware of what percentage were returned to production, what percentage were plugged, or
I'm-
which percentage are in compliance?
I'm not. The purpose of that exercise was to just take a look at some random sampling. And my big point about that was that under current regulations, there is no provision where an operator has to justify putting a well into TA status. And I think that's unacceptable.
And that random sample wasn't generated by you. That was done by a staff member. Or an
No, I
intern?
did it. I did it. I just accessed the OCD site and just started picking here and there over various periods of time. I think I state in my direct testimony how I went about it, but I did that.
And then the final question I have is on Exhibit 11, which is the wells in approved or expired TA status. It's a line chart. Share that again.
Is that the one with two line two graph,
Yes, there's a green, a dark green and a light green line.
let me turn to it. I've got it.
And so your testimony is that these numbers have been increasing, but in this analysis, did you take into account the fact that the number of wells in New Mexico has increased significantly over the past 2 decades?
No,
Okay. Thank you. I have no further questions.
Thank you very much, Ms. Tripp. Ms. Brandfield, do you have questions of Mr. Alexander?
No, Miss Hearing Examiner, I do not.
Thank you. Mr. Rankin, do you have questions of Mr. Alexander?
I do, and I wonder if we might take us a very short break before I initiate that.
All right, let's take a short break. Come back in like 5 minutes.
Yes.
All right.
Thank you.
back from the break, please? Hello. Let's come back from the break, please. All right, we turn now to Mr. Rankin and his questions on behalf of OCC USA.
Thank you very much, Madam Hearing Officer. Good afternoon, Mr. Alexander. Welcome. Thank you for your time today. As the hearing officer mentioned, I'm counsel for OCC. So we appreciate your comments and support of OCC's engagement with WELC and the applicants in this rulemaking. Thank you.
Absolutely. It's a pleasure working with y'all.
Well, of course, we agreed on some things, but not everything, right?
Right.
And I'm sorry, Mr.
Oh.
Rankin, to interrupt.
Yep.
We are making a transcript, and so it's really important not to speak on the end of each other's sentences and also not to speak quite too fast.
Mr. Alexander, before I get into the portions of the rule that we don't agree with, I'm going to just ask you just to fill out a couple more aspects or details about your background experience for my edification. Your work was in mostly dry gas basins, is that right?
Yeah, Arkansas is a dry gas basin.
And do you have any experience working in a conventional or unconventional oil basin?
Conventional oil, yes, East Texas, Hardeman Basin, DJ, but nothing horizontal.
Okay. And in your past experience working in the field, what specifically experience do you have looking at increasing the life of wells? What sort of things did you do in the field to increase the life of the wells that you were in charge of?
Well, I think some of the best examples I would say is when I first went to work for Southwestern Energy. As a consultant, I was given about a 30-well package to evaluate on Fort Chaffee for any possible upgrade in production or do they need to be plugged, et cetera. So a total review of the well files and the geology, and actually didn't come up with anything much. Just keep doing what you're doing. But from that grew an effort to begin to apply plunger lift to dozens of the conventional wells. It was quite an adventure, I will tell you, because the pumpers would tell me things like, well, them things don't work in Arkansas, whatever. Dozens of wells later, we extended the life of many wells. We got rid of soaping and blowing, which is wasteful. It takes a lot of time and effort. And then I spent quite a bit of time reviewing a number of wells and well files. You got to understand, originally SECO or Southwestern Energy drilled wells in that basin to supply Arkansas Western gas and ship gas up to northwestern Arkansas. So their MO was a little different. They didn't necessarily frack a lot of wells. So I went in and take a look at a lot of wells that had high permeability, still enough reservoir pressure. You can hit them with some foam, nitrogen foam, and really increase production and increase the ultimate recovery. So I did quite a bit of work on really that whole set of 250 or 300 conventional wells.
So the range of options would be depends on the reservoir, depends on the nature of the reservoir, whether it's conventional or unconventional. Would you agree the type of activities that would be potentially under review?
Yes.
And that would include recompletions, workovers to add artificial lift, other types of things, correct?
Yeah, we got rid of a lot of dual and triple completions and turned them into singles, and yeah, all of the above.
Did you ever evaluate wells for converting to disposal, for water disposal?
Yeah, one set of wells early on in the Fayetteville Shale experience, we bought some properties from an operator, and in that part of the basin, there's quite a few really nice packages of sand, and we spruced up and or converted some wells to disposal wells.
Okay, so those are among the types of things that operators might look at that could potentially be beneficial use or extend the life of a well. Correct?
Absolutely.
Okay. Now, when you made these determinations in your experience, you never yourself looked at potentially converting to EOR or looking at a potential.
I've never personally been involved with EOR.
Whether secondary recovery or tertiary recovery, any kind of.
I have not. I've been peripherally around it. We had some of those operations, but I was never involved with it.
So potential beneficial uses would depend on the type of reservoir, the condition of the well, what surface facilities are available or what might need to be added. So there's a range of issues that might need to be evaluated to determine how or whether a well could be extended.
That's correct.
Okay. Now, so you would agree with me that lots of factors at play, depending on where the well is, the field, potential reservoirs in the stacked system, how old the well is, the condition of the well, all those things, right?
Correct.
Okay. Now, I want to kind of move over and talk a little bit about your testimony about the registration and compliance requirements under the new proposed rules that you're proposing. Now, your testimony and your experience was primarily with smaller oil and gas companies, correct? Your personal experience was with smaller oil and gas.
Depends on your definition of small. Southwestern Energy ultimately operated around 4,500 wells. I don't think that's small.
Okay.
But, in the time period from Schlumberger to Southwestern, 4 or 5 companies that were, 50 or 100 wells or less, something like that. But that's half or less of my experience.
Did Southwestern operate wells across different states
Yes.
and on federal land as well as state land
Yes.
and private lands as well, correct?
Yes.
And when you were in charge or when you oversaw the production from Southwestern Energy, were you ever required to certify that your company's operations were in compliance with all state and federal regulations?
I didn't personally have to do that, but somebody did.
And you reviewed and discussed with Oxy the challenges of having to do that as the rule was originally proposed, correct?
I think so.
Yeah, and as a result, the applicant has changed and agreed with the proposals made by Oxy for the rule, correct?
Correct.
Okay. And as a result of those discussions with Oxy, applicant has changed its proposed rule to adopt what Oxy was proposing for the requirements of certification. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Now, I want to talk a little bit more about getting the things that we didn't agree on. So that was one area that we did agree, right, was on some changes to the certifications.
Yeah.
But I think I also want to now discuss some of the areas where we weren't able to reach agreement. In your testimony, you refer to, and others have asked you about this, the Legislative Finance Committee issued a report recently addressing the issue of abandoned wells in New Mexico, correct?
Yes.
And that was marked as your exhibit number 4 in your
I think
exhibit
so.
packet,
I think
right?
so.
Now, in your testimony, you cite to that report in support of the proposed rules, right?
Say that
You
again.
cite to that report in support of the proposed rules that
Yes.
you're
Yeah.
supporting, right?
Yes.
Yeah. And you've made numerous recommendations in this proposed rulemaking that address the issues that were raised in that LFC report, correct?
Some of the issues, not all.
Okay. In general, I understood your testimony to be that the proposed rules here generally track the recommendations made in the LFC report.
Generally, yes.
Right. And some of those recommended changes were regulatory in nature, right? The LFC made recommendations to the Energy Minerals Department that they should update their rules, correct?
Correct.
And that's what the applicants here have proposed to do, correct?
Correct.
And the proposals here, obviously, because we're in a regulatory environment, are limited to the regulatory changes, right? The applicants are only proposing regulatory changes.
Correct.
Right. And they're not seeking to make the legislative changes that the LFC recommended, correct?
No.
Okay. So, but the LFC did make recommendations for legislative changes, correct?
I think so.
Okay. So I'm going to share my screen and just walk through some of your testimony and then ask you specifically about some aspects of the LFC report, okay?
Okay.
So on page 16 of your direct testimony here at the bottom on line 23, I've highlighted, and it goes on to the next page, and I'll read it out loud. It says, New Mexico amended its financial assurance provisions in the Oil and Gas Act in 2018, but the amendment limiting blanket bonds for an operator's active wells, to $250,000 was sorely inadequate at the time, and certainly is now when the average cost to OCD to plug and abandon one well exceeds $150,000. Did I read that correctly?
Yes.
Okay. And the amendment that you're talking about here in your testimony is specifically relating to a statute. It's 70-2-14. Is that your understanding?
I think so. I don't have that in front of me.
No reason to disagree, right?
Right.
Right. Okay. I know you said that you're not a lawyer. Sometimes I wish I wasn't either, but nevertheless, that's what you're citing, right?
Okay. Yes.
Okay. Now, are you generally familiar with the language of that statute? Have you looked at it? Are you familiar with it?
I would say generally no.
Okay. But you cite to it, you reference it in your
The
testimony.
Oil and Gas Act you're talking about?
Well, it's part of the Oil and Gas Act. It's
Yeah.
the specific statute that addresses the financial assurance requirements.
Right.
Have you reviewed that statute?
In the past, probably,
Okay.
but not recently.
But
And
you,
I do talk about it here, but I do want to make this statement again, is that I'm not the expert here on financial assurance. And a lot of these types of things are going to be relying upon our expert who will be after me.
well, I understand. I heard you say that, but I'm definitely going to focus in on your testimony. Okay.
Okay, that's fine.
And then if, but I understand that there's another witness who also is going to testify on that, but I'm definitely going to just ask you about your
Sure.
testimony. Okay. Okay. So you have reviewed that statute, but you're not very familiar with it.
Correct.
Okay. So I'll go ahead and pull it up then. Just give me a moment. I've got the statute here. It's 70-2-14, and I've highlighted the language here. So basically, under subsection A, it provides that the Oil Conservation Division shall establish categories of financial assurance after notice and hearing. Are you familiar with this statute now that I've got it in front of you?
Okay.
Okay. And it goes on to say, and I've highlighted in different colors, it goes on to say, as it identifies different categories of financial assurance, the first one being, and I've highlighted this in green, a blanket plugging bond, a blanket plugging financial assurance, which shall be set by rule in an amount not to exceed $250,000. Did I read that correctly?
Yes.
Okay. And that, as you understand, does that apply to all active wells?
Active and inactive, as I'd understand it.
So you understand that applies to inactive wells as well?
It could be, yes.
Okay.
I would think.
But you cited to the LFC report, right? And do you recall what the LFC report has to say about what aspect of what wells those apply to?
No, I don't.
Okay. But your understanding is that that blanket bond would apply to all active and inactive wells. Is that your understanding?
I would think.
Okay. So under the statute, OCD is tasked, or the commission is tasked with setting by rule the exact amount of this blanket plugging financial assurance for up to $250,000, correct?
That's what it says.
And then your understanding is that's what the division currently has set as the maximum?
I believe that's true in the current rules.
Okay. But OCD under this rule, under the statute, can't exceed the 250,000 limit for blanket plugging, correct?
That's what it says.
Okay. But it goes on to say that it can create additional categories of financial assurance, correct?
Objection. Mr. Rankin is really seeking a legal opinion from Mr. Alexander, and he's not here for that.
Yeah, and he's not a regulator either. If he were a regulator, I'd feel differently.
Well, I'm asking him these questions because he testifies that it's sorely inadequate, and I'm just trying to understand why. And he testifies at length about the LFC report and the $250,000 plugging bond limit.
But you're not taking him through that LFC report, you're taking him through a statute.
I am initially, but I intend to come back to the LFC report.
Madam Hearing Officer, he can ask why Mr. Alexander thinks a $250,000 blanket bond is insufficient. But I think going through the statutory construction is out of the, outside the scope.
And outside of his area of expertise.
Okay. I will not ask you any more questions about the statute, at least to opine on its construction. So let me ask you this then. Is it your understanding that all active wells would be covered by this $250,000 blanket bond, correct?
I would,
Objection, are you referring to the statute or the regulation? And we've already discussed that he's not going to talk about his interpretation of the statute.
Well, let me ask you this. You testified, Mr. Alexander, that here that in the portion of the testimony I asked you that the $250,000 blanket bond was woefully inadequate, correct?
that's what I said.
Okay. And based on that, and you believe it's inadequate, is it your opinion that it's inadequate because that applies to all active wells? And that's not enough money to cover the plugging of
The
all active
reference
wells?
here, as I say,
Objection asked and answered about active and inactive.
Right, you've already led him through that, Mr. Rankin.
Mr. Alexander, please testify to me why it is that you believe that the $250,000 blanket bond is inadequate.
because of the cost that it actually costs to plug and abandon a well these days.
Okay. So because
And that's the gap we're trying to close.
right. So an operator under the current regulatory and statutory scheme, operators can choose to have a blanket bond, correct?
I think I'm not the expert on FA. I really can't say that too many times.
Well, again, I'm just asking you because you said it was inadequate here and I'm trying to
It is
understand.
inadequate with respect to how much it costs to actually plug wells.
Okay. And that's because they have a choice, right, between doing a blanket bond, which is limited to $250,000, right? For all their wells in the
Versus
state.
a single well bond.
Well, I'm asking you what's your understanding because you testified that the $250,000 was inadequate.
I'm saying it's inadequate with respect to what, I'm simply saying it's inadequate with respect to the actual costs that operators are incurring or would incur to plug a well. That's all I'm saying.
Okay. And so because of that, you're saying it needs to be higher, right?
I believe it does.
Okay.
So does our other expert witness, so does OCD.
And so as a result, under the proposed rules, then applicants are proposing to create a new category of wells, which are marginal wells. Is that correct?
Yes,
And that new category of wells would have a different financial assurance applied to them, correct?
yes.
And that would be $150,000 per well, correct?
I was not involved with that determination. Our next witness will get into that and you can ask him all those questions.
Okay. So on the LFC report, you reviewed this LFC report and you highlighted a number of provisions throughout this report. Do you recall that?
I really, I don't know where that's coming from. What do you mean I highlighted a number of provisions?
Well,
This is not mine.
this is Exhibit 4 of Welk's of your exhibit packet,
Okay.
correct?
Okay,
And there's highlighting in here, that I understand, because it's your,
I don't, I mean, I may have, I read it for sure, and I've referred to some of these things,
Mhm.
sure.
now I highlighted myself, the red highlighting is what was part of the exhibit. And then I
Okay.
highlighted this section here in between what you had highlighted. Do you see that?
Yeah.
Okay. And I highlighted the section here that says, on top of that, there are more than 3,000 wells on state or private land producing extremely small quantities of oil and gas, whose expected cleanup costs far exceed their predicted future revenues, increasing their risk of being orphaned. Did I read that correctly?
You did?
And it is my understanding is that this goes to the heart of applicants' concerns here, is that for these marginal wells, as the production decreases, there's a risk of these wells being orphaned, correct?
There is a risk, yes.
Do you know whether the LFC evaluated these wells and the reservoirs to determine what
I don't know.
okay. So you don't know if there was any sort of engineering or reservoir engineering analysis done?
I don't know specifically, but I would imagine that there was some amount of information gathered and an assessment made to make a statement such as that. I don't think they just pulled that out of thin air.
It wasn't just based on the production numbers?
It could have been.
But if you were an operator of a well, you'd want to look at more than just the production numbers to understand
Generally,
right. What sort of things would you look at?
well, I'd do some decline curve analysis, and depending on the type of reservoir, you could do a P over Z plot, and that's basically looking at pressure. Of course, pressure is always a viable thing to look at. I'd look at the geology. I would look at offset operators, what's going on around. I mean, there's a whole host of things that you could look at. But, you can basically do a decline curve analysis, and if there's no reason to believe there's not something else really wrong with the well, tells you a lot.
So you'd want to look at, as I think you mentioned, looking offset production, look at other stacked horizons, right? If there's other opportunities.
Yep.
You want to look at, determine whether or not the reservoir is still as viable with the production, what the pressure is, right? All those things. Whether or not there's a potential for EOR.
Correct.
Some of the factors that you and I discussed previously, right? About what might an operator look at to determine whether that well still got future life, maybe in a different zone, or
And we listed a lot of those typical things the types of data that would be available to the operator is to state their case for beneficial use.
And wouldn't you want to know what the full evaluation is of such assessments before you made a determination about whether the cleanup costs exceed future predicted revenues?
In general, yes.
Right. So we don't know as we read this or any parts of this report, like what actually analyses were done to evaluate whether or not any of these wells might have the ability.
We don't know that, but it could have been a thorough analysis. Who knows?
Okay. Move into some questions about temporary abandonment. Applicant's proposal is to limit temporary abandonment status to a maximum of 8 years, correct?
That's our proposal, yes.
And your testimony is that only a small percentage of wells from a data set were actually ever returned to production after 8 years, correct?
That's correct.
But you agree that some wells are returned to production after more than 8 years in TA status, of course. And those are the exceptions you're talking about, right?
Of course.
And under the proposal that is before the commission at this point, the proposed rule would not allow for any additional extensions to TA status beyond those 8 years, correct?
Under the proposed rules. But I would also point out, I said 3 times in my testimony this morning, I understand the concern there. And based on 4 or 5 different principles, there could be some exception language developed.
So do you believe it's appropriate to provide for some exception language to allow for the division to have discretion to evaluate the potential for extending a well?
I think it's
in TA
worth
status?
investigating.
Okay. And I think I'm gonna turn to this. I've written down what you said, and I'm gonna ask you about that in a moment. Okay, but I'm gonna work through a couple of questions first. First of all, as I understand the rule, as proposed, the applicant's proposal is to limit the extension, right, to 2 years,
Yes,
right? And that would be true whether or not the initial TA status was for 1 year or 5 years, correct?
no, if a well is in TA, approved TA, and these rules passed, then they would be able to continue for 4 more years to have that 5-year term, and then reapply for 2 more.
I think under the proposal, isn't there a 1 year TA status under the proposed rule as well as a 5-year TA status for the initial TA period?
I don't recall that.
So under your understanding as you sit here is that the first TA status period would be for a period of 5 years.
Correct.
Okay. And that's your intent would be to have a rule that allowed for a 5-year TA status initially.
Correct.
Okay. So the 2-year extension would make a maximum of 7 years for TA status, approved TA status, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. But now getting to your point that in your testimony today, get to that here. You said there were four different things I think that would make sense to consider by the division to increase potentially a well into a additional TA period, correct?
4 or 5, yes.
Scope of scope of the, you said scope, I'm not sure what you meant by scope.
Limited in scope, limit and say for EOR or whatever, limited in time, subject to periodic OCD review, based on solid engineering, technical, and economic information, and then not based on guesswork, hunches, or speculation or the like.
Okay. And if you reviewed Oxy's testimony addressing its proposed modifications to applicant's rule.
Yeah, and yes, I did.
And I thought I understood you to say that Oxy was proposing something that would not allow for OCD to review or to look at additional information, but that would require open-ended extensions of the TA period.
That's the way we read it. Yes.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
So if Oxy actually did provide for, an orderly approach so that provide additional information, demonstrate whatever additional information the division requires, and that therefore at the division's discretion would be allowed to thereby extend or put a well into additional TA status. Do you think that's appropriate?
Wonderful.
So you agree with me that the division, based on its expertise, would be able to evaluate the appropriateness of going beyond the 8 years that the applicants propose for additional TA status periods based on the information that the division wants to see and would expect to see from an operator.
Yeah, I trust their ability to evaluate that adequately. Yes.
Okay. Because essentially, I think that's what your testimony was, that the division should have discretion to determine, it's the provision that it strikes the continuously, and I don't have that right from me. I think it's
Yeah. Yes.
right.
Yeah. We can go to that definition.
I think it's slide 8 on your demonstrative.
Got it.
Under 19.15.28, 28.8, your testimony was that the division should have discretion to know whether a well is actually inactive or not within that 1 year period, right? Even though you're striking the continuous continuously from.
Yeah,
provision.
according to the division, this was direct communication with them. The operators have abused this provision here, B3, and we propose, and they agree to strike continuously because they'll produce a well for a very minimal period of time to kind of reset the inactive clock. And that's not correct. That's not the right way to go about business.
But in this instance here, you're saying that the division should have discretion to determine what the true intent is or whether the well is actually inactive or not, right?
Yes.
Okay. And you agree with me that the same discretion can be applied to determine whether a well should be extended in a TA status beyond the 8 years that the applicant had proposed.
Correct.
Objection, well, that misstates the evidence because he laid forth five principles that would have to be applied for the exercise of discretion.
I do remember that.
Yeah, yeah.
So based on those principles, the division should have discretion to determine whether or not a well should be continued in TA status.
Yes, and the language needs to be very carefully crafted so that there's not loopholes in there for somebody to abuse the intent and the actual language.
But you're not offering any principles under which the division can determine whether or not a well is inactive under 1915-28-8, are you?
No,
And they have broad discretion to decide whether or not an operator is playing the system by simply turning a well on or off during that period of time, correct?
correct.
Okay. So no guidance here. And does that give the
The guidance
regulators?
is clear. Get rid of the loophole that the operators are using to avoid the 12-month period of inactivity and keep on extending it.
But it's up to the division to figure out whether or not they're trying to violate the loophole or actually are operating the well appropriately, given the reservoir or other conditions, correct? So there's no principle here under which you've given the division to decide whether or not a well is inactive or not.
Well, if we can get rid of one word and close the loophole, why worry about having the division trying to determine whether a well has actually not been producing for 12 months or not?
Okay. So in this instance, this rule was proposed and went through the rulemaking to come up with this language. And now without this guidance, will the operators, in your opinion, or the division have certainty about how this rule is going to be applied going forward?
I think if it is adopted as proposed, I think there will be certainty.
Okay. Well, what principles does the division have to determine whether a well is inactive if they no longer have if it's no longer simply about whether it's been continuously inactive for that period of time?
I'm not,
If you don't understand the question, you can
I
ask
don't
that
really
it be
understand.
restated.
What do you mean, I mean, if the well is producing or not?
I guess that's the way the rule was, right? If a well was inactive, continuously inactive for that period of time, then it was, but by eliminating the continuously, now it's not clear under what principles the division has to determine whether it's inactive or not.
It either is producing, in which case it's not inactive, or it is not producing, in which case it is inactive. It's one or the other.
Okay. On the proposal to have the TA status go to a hearing, it's the applicant's proposal that for an extension, an applicant seeking to extend the TA status would have to go to a hearing before the division, correct?
Correct.
Who would be required under the proposal to be given notice of an application?
They go. Say that question again, please.
Under the applicant's proposal, who would be required to receive notice of such an application?
I don't know the answer to that.
Does the proposal provide direction on who should be provided notice?
Well, the operator would be given notice. Are you asking me who?
Yeah, I mean, if the operator of the well, right, the well that's under TA status is applying to extend the TA status, who do they give notice to of a hearing? Of the application to extend the TA?
Oh, who does the operator give notice to?
Yeah.
I don't know the answer to that.
Okay. Is it in the rule? Is it clear in the proposal by applicants?
No, it is not.
Okay. Is there any guidance or what interested parties would be permitted to potentially intervene in that case? Any-
Well, I would say that based on the way the rule is proposed, that any interested party may come.
And so under the definition of the rule, they would have to demonstrate some sort of standing, correct? Some standing in order to intervene.
Well, we didn't actually say that.
Okay. But is it your intent to have any member of the public be able to intervene, to opine
Yeah, and
on?
in my experience, particularly at Arkansas, anybody could come and listen. So, now, if it got to the point where you're going to be discussing confidential information, you clear the deck.
Let me ask you this. I'm not asking about who can come and listen. I'm asking about who can actually participate as a party. Is it your intent to allow any member of the public to appear at a hearing on the TA status of a well?
I would
appear
say
as a
that the
party?
intent to provide transparency.
For them to appear as a party, meaning that they could present evidence?
No. They can just be part of the process, listen. And if there is a point in time during this where anybody that's in the audience is given an opportunity to make a comment, then so be it.
So are you aware that the current regulations governing adjudications before the division allow for public to require public notice, allow for parties to appear publicly and make public comments?
I'm not aware of that particular regulation.
So if that were the case, would that satisfy applicants to allow the public to appear, to have transparency, to see how these things are operated?
Well, I'd have to read that to opine on that, but it sounds reasonable.
Now, are you familiar with the division's current regulatory hearing docket?
No.
Are you familiar with how many hearings are on the schedule every month?
No,
Are you aware that they currently only hear new applications once a month or 12 times
no,
a
I'm
year?
not aware of that.
Are you aware that the hearing officer is currently limited each hearing to only 60 new applications?
Unanswered.
I'm asking,
It doesn't sound as though he has testimony to offer.
okay. Mr. Alexander, I want to ask you a little bit about waste. You testified to some extent already in questioning with Ms. Tripp about waste, and you have a general understanding of what waste means in the oil and gas industry. Agree?
Yes,
And as I understand, you understand that the division and commission have an obligation to prevent waste, agree?
yes,
And I understand you to say that that as a result of this rule, at least as to the non-beneficial wells, you've identified that there's going to be some impact to production in the state, correct?
yes.
But you haven't analyzed what effect the rule would have on the economics of operators, right? You haven't evaluated what that would mean, how many additional wells or what production or what volumes might be shut in or what wells might be plugged as a result of implementation of this rule, correct?
Well, I think we did in Exhibit 40. took a look at the number of wells that would be in this category of rebuttal presumption of beneficial use, 90 BOE, 90 days, 12 consecutive months. And that represented, I think, 0.003% of total production.
Understood. And I guess what I'm asking is, so you've analyzed what number of wells and production might be impacted by, that would fall into the no beneficial use category, right?
Yeah.
But you haven't analyzed what the economic impact would be of this additional financial assurance burden on
No.
operators, right?
No.
And you haven't analyzed how many wells or what volume of production might be lost as a result of the implementation of this rule, have you?
Not specifically. I have not. Now, our next witness may have more on that. I don't know.
So you're not aware of anybody on behalf of the applicant making an analysis to determine what potential effect on waste the rule would have?
I don't think it'll have any effect on waste. Get my point about what I think about waste. Yeah, you can produce a well way below its economic limit. And you can sit there and say, well, we're not wasting oil and gas resources. Of course you're not, but you're operating at a detriment economically. And I think that's a waste.
Mr. Rankin, you have 5 minutes.
Understand. Thank you. But your testimony, I'll ask other witnesses, but your testimony, you've not yourself done an analysis like
I have not.
to determine what effect beyond the non-beneficial use wells this proposed rule would have on other wells in their production in the state, correct?
I haven't.
Okay. And have you done a similar analysis, nor have you done a similar analysis for the potential impacts on correlative rights? Agree?
No.
Are you aware of anybody on behalf of the applicants who has done
At
that
this point,
analysis?
no.
Okay. No further questions.
All right, thank you very much, Mr. Rankin. Mr. Maxwell, do you have questions of Mr. Alexander?
Your Honor, my question has been asked and answered. I do not. Thank you.
Thank you. Is Ms. Nanasi with us? No? All right. Mr. Moore, for the State Land Office, do you have questions of Mr. Alexander?
I do not, Madam Hearing Examiner. Thank you.
Thank you. And Mr. Tremaine?
I just have a couple questions, Madam Hearing Examiner. Thank you. Good afternoon now, Mr. Alexander. My name is Jesse Tremaine for the Oil Conservation Division. I want to ask you a clarifying question about your, if it was your direct or your rebuttal testimony earlier. I believe you made a statement to the effect that some of the logs that OCD had recommended or proposed for approved TA status may not be strictly necessary for newer wells. Is that fair?
Correct.
Characterization? Okay. Even if you assume that there's a high degree of confidence in well integrity at the time of the original TA application or at the time of a new well, would you agree that the logs proposed by OCD could establish a useful baseline of information for a situation where later in a well's productive life or extended TA, OCD needs to look back and see information reflected in those logs?
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you. I want to draw your attention to, we've talked at length, and I think we will continue speaking at length about the wanted LFC report. On page 15, Mr. Suazo had asked you a question about the line, New Mexico does not define orphaned well in statute or rule. I'd like to draw your attention to the second line of that paragraph immediately after the one which you were prompted. For this report, orphaned wells are those for which OCD has already pursued and received plugging authority, either through a settlement agreement or administrative hearings, because those represent the most immediate and certain costs. Mr. Alexander, when you reviewed the LFC report, would you agree that the LFC did in fact define orphan well for the purposes of the report and the numbers generated as part of the report?
I would. It's also reflected on page 4.
Well, you beat me to my next question.
Oh,
Great.
sorry.
So, so we're in agreement that the same definition is listed on page 4. Thank you. One more question for you, Mr. Alexander. As a prior manager of operators of various different sizes, if you were managing a portfolio that included a well that produced, say, 50 barrels of oil equivalent in the previous 12 months, how would you analyze that well and what would you have done with it?
Well, I can tell you if the production was at that level, I'd have been looking at it long before then. And it would be a process of assessing through decline curve analysis. Are we talking about an oil or gas well? You know, are there any potential upgrades, recompletions? Is there a zone that hadn't been fracked? There's a lot of things that would go into analyzing, is this the end state or not? And like I say, we would have done it 50 BOE in a year. I mean, if there's nothing else to that well, that thing would have been plugged a long time ago.
And could you describe what a long time ago would mean? What kind of production threshold or a point in time would you?
Well, you know, the economic limit is dependent upon a lot of things. You know, what kind of surface equipment do you have, compression, et cetera. But, you know, every basin, you know, has kind of a basic economic limit based on the type of production, the type of reservoirs, and the type of operator. You know, Exxon's economic limit is going to be up here. Joe and Sally's are going to be down here. So, you know, we would just, I would have looked at all of those things and long in advance. And, you know, a well doesn't, you know, if a well is all of a sudden clipping along and now it's making 50 BOE, maybe something broke. I mean, I got examples that I worked on in Arkansas, turned wells into great wells. But if it's been generally declining like that, some sort of an exponential decline, yeah, it would have been uneconomic a long time ago based on current prices. Does that answer your question?
You did. Thank you. No further questions.
Mr. Tremaine is completed.
Yes, no further questions.
Thank you so much. Ms. Fox, do you have redirect you'd like to pursue?
Yes, Madam Hearing Officer, only one question.
Okay.
Mr. Alexander, Mr. Suazo asked you whether you had a specific example that supports your support for the proposal for the presumptions of no beneficial use, a specific example from New Mexico, and you said you did not, correct?
That's correct.
You haven't worked in New Mexico. You were clear about that, correct?
Very clear.
What is the basis for your support for the 90 BOE 90-day threshold for presumptions of no beneficial use based on your personal experience?
Just basic economics. I mean, I don't know of a well ever with making 1/4 of a barrel of oil a day that's economic. The price of the product would have to be humongous for that to be economic. So it's just based on experience. In the LFC report, they were talking about 2 barrels a day. You know, that's, you know, they made the comment that that's probably a reasonable number. So something less than that is just way out of bounds in my experience.
Thank you, Madam Hearing Officer. That's all I have.
All right, thank you. We would turn next to questions from the commissioners. Commissioners, do you want to go to that now or take a break before you go to that? What's your pleasure?
I don't have any questions for this witness, so I don't have a preference. It's up to the rest of the commissioners.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Commissioner Bloom?
Dr. Ampoma, would you like to go first?
Commissioner Ampoma.
Sure. Thank you. Mr. Alexander, thanks so much for your testimony. I do have a couple of questions for you. So I'm going to start with your slide number 3 in your from your PowerPoint. the beneficial purposes or the beneficial use. So on the last point, a well for speculative purposes. So in your testimony, you also more or less agreed to the fact that geothermal EOR will all form part of the, let's say, beneficial use. Now, my question to you is that, are all those not speculative?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that question?
Okay, so I'm looking at your slide number 3.
Yeah, I got that.
Okay, so you use the term such as, and you've talked about it
Such as, okay, got it.
multiple over.
Yeah.
You said production, injection, or monitoring. And based on the cross, there was a discussion about what about geothermal? What about EOR? And you said that will still form part of the beneficial use. And I'm asking you, are those additional examples not speculative?
No, this is a two-part definition, but to be clear, such as could easily have just said, for example, production, injection, or monitoring, which opens the window up for anything that is actually of beneficial use. And it's separate and apart from the last part of that definition. And we wanted to be clear, but it does not include use of a well for speculative purposes. In other words, as some of the others have testified, well, there might be a new technology down the road. Let's just wait another 10 years and just see what happens. So they're very different parts. Okay, does that make sense?
It does, but the use of the speculative purposes, and that is not actually defined in your proposed rule. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So would that not be confusing?
Well, it's not confusing to me, in my opinion. I think in general, based on the definition in a standard dictionary, speculative is pretty well defined.
So what that would mostly based on the judgment from OCD. Is that correct?
To some extent, and if there needs to be a definition for speculation, that would be easy to do.
So if I turn over to this one will be the rebuttal testimony and exhibits submitted by the applicants. So I'm looking at page 53, which will be actually page 11 on the document, but page 53 on the PDF. So there was a question, Nimoga, hopefully you are there. Can I proceed?
I don't have their document.
Oh, okay.
Are you referring to Mr. Alexander's rebuttal testimony?
Yes.
Oh, mine.
There is a
My-
document that is applicant's rebuttal testimony and exhibits. And we went through that, question and answers. Okay,
And Commissioner, what page are you referring to in his rebuttal testimony?
so this will be on page 53 on the actual PDF, but it is actually page 11. Applicant's
you.
exhibit 73. Okay.
So are you referring to Nimoga's offering? Okay, I got it.
Thank you. Okay.
I've got it. So what's the question?
Yeah, thank you. So Nimoga offers the following definitions for beneficial purposes and beneficial use. And, you put that in parentheses there. Now, my question to you is this not comprehensive enough?
No, I think it oversteps actually. So Nimoga proposed a 4-paragraph definition. What we're saying is that at least the last 3 are not definitional at all. They're more regulatory and they have no reason to be in a definition. The first paragraph is more definition. But we think that ours is really more specific and easier to understand.
So do you have any concern if the commission decides to adapt at least the first paragraph, as you mentioned, of NIMOGA's definition?
Hold on just a second, please, sir. So I would say this. We look at our definition. It's very simple and concise, and it adheres to part of the definition of an inactive well. Okay? And this term such as, all right, opens the window up for any type of beneficial use. Their definition, adds additional possible uses, and they do use, it includes, but it's not limited to, so it's sort of an example. I just think that this is I just think ours is just more concise. I mean, would I have a whole lot of heartburn? I don't know if that's probably speculation on my part. I'd really have to think about it a little bit longer.
Thank you. So I'll move on to slide number 8 of your PowerPoint.
Is this on the rebuttal or the direct?
No, the direct, number 8. And it's titled Wells to be Properly Abandoned.
Okay.
So in your item B, you strike down 90 to 30 days.
Correct.
Is there any problem with 60 days?
Not really.
Now, have you reviewed or are you familiar with OCD normal enforcement timelines? Have you reviewed that?
No.
And so you did not review that prior to more or less suggesting the 30 days?
We're just trying to compress the time, but like I said, I wouldn't be averse to 60. I wouldn't be averse to 90. Let's just get it done.
So if we leave it as 90, because I do know that based on some of the other hearings that I've been through, normally the timeline for enforcement is mostly 90 days through some of the documentations, and OCD can respond to that during their time. So you say that you do not have any problem if we still keep it at 90?
I personally don't.
Okay, thank you. Now let's go to slide number 9, still on your direct. Under the presumptions of no beneficial use. Now, so on the first one, A, the last sentence or the last part, the well has not produced for at least 90 days and has not produced at least 90 barrels of oil equivalent. Now, let me ask, so you said that the industry was not involved in drafting the rule, the proposed rule. So how did you come up with a 90 without industry input for this particular statement?
First of all, this entire slide came from OCD. We adopted it, right? And second of all, we asked industry on a number of occasions to engage, let's talk about this, and they never did.
So then I presume the same response will be for the B when you talk about the SWD.
Correct.
Thank you. Now let's look at D, number 1. Documentation demonstrating that the well is reasonably projected to produce or paying quantities. So my question to you is that based on all the back and forth today, do you still stand by the statement?
I do.
So how are we going to be able to determine, let's say, one particular well producing and paying quantities? Is there any metrics that OCD is going to be able to use to more or less ascertain that?
I think it'd be incumbent upon the operator who's coming before OCD to rebut. That's the whole purpose of item D is the process by which the rebuttal is forwarded. They need to produce the evidence.
And will this one be purposely targeting like primary recovery wells?
No.
Now, so then help me understand, how does this provision also applies to, let's say, a well that is not producing significantly high, but in actual production profile of a field, we go from primary, and then once the well is not able to produce at its own energy, then it goes down. So we cannot operate that well until we make a decision to start pressure maintenance, or at least start injecting above the bubble point pressure, and we can start producing again. And at some point, irrespective of any water that you inject into the well, we are not going to be able to produce this well, and that gets to the residual oil status. And at some point, we have to inject CO2 to be able to get this up. So I'm trying to understand how this provision takes into consideration all these various cycles in our typical petroleum recovery process.
Well, when I discussed that earlier today, there are two elements of this. Paying quantities as it applies to a single well. So say a single well is holding a lease. That's a pretty straightforward matter. How much is the well making? How much does it cost? And if it's making more than it costs, it's in paying quantities. The other part that Namoga, I believe it was, brought up about the lease level. And that gets into the EOR, and that's a more complicated situation, sir. I agree with that 100%. But again, I think that in the presentation to OCD, if you're in an EOR project and you're waiting on fronts to hit or whatever, and you produce evidence that says, you know, this well is not making any oil, we understand that, but here's why, and here's why we still need to keep it. I think that all comes into the presentation to address the wells that are in question.
Yeah, then, but you still cap the, let's say the TA status to about 8 years. And even on that one, my question to you is, where in your proposed rule do we have the 8 years?
Have the what?
The 8 years cap.
ATS.
8.
Oh, 8 years cap. Okay. The 8-year cap is the proposal, and then extensions of that we talked about. We think are reasonable based upon, you know, a time limit, a scope, economics, you know, a reasonable presentation of technical data and OCD reviews. So we're not objecting to that at all.
So that is not actually part of the rule itself?
Not yet. There are principles that we understand the concern of some parties about, especially on EOR projects.
So let's go to slide number 11 of your direct, entitled Approved Temporary Abandonment. You know, so when I read through all of this, I'm still concerned about how these proposed rules, you know, takes into consideration all the entire production cycle of a typical field. Now, you said that I'm reading from how the well will be put to beneficial use in the future, including supporting technical and economic data. So I'm wondering, let's say, what are the metrics, as to how an operator needs to be able to prove the economic data when, for instance, a well is TA and is going to be used during, let's say, secondary recovery or tertiary recovery, is way far ahead. So how is a company going to, or let's say, what is the metrics that OCD is going to be able to judge, whether that economic data, or let's say, especially the economic data, how accurate is that? Or how accurate would that be?
Well, in the case of an EOR project, and again, I have to admit, I've never been involved with that, but I would think it'd be a fairly straightforward procedure for the operator to demonstrate to OCD that these wells, although they are in TA, we're going to change the injection pattern or change the production pattern or change from water to CO2, whatever the case may be, and provide them good evidence based on the rocks, injection profiles, production profiles. This is what we expect to happen in X number of years.
Yeah, so that is where my concern is, because a normal primary recovery is going to be about 10 years, 5 to 10 years. And the secondary recovery is going to be about 30 years. And then you have tertiary also going to be about 30 years, 20 to 30 years. So assuming we are in the primary recovery, and then a well is producing so low based on the threshold that you have provided, right in the primary recovery time. But how is the company going to be able to prove the technical and economics of how this well is going to be useful, let's say for tertiary recovery?
Well, I would put it this way. If there's, substantial evidence of nearby fields or whatever in a particular reservoir that they have been successful after primary into secondary and into tertiary, and the rock properties and the arrangements of the wells and the geology all tend to be similar to something that actually does work, you got a good deal on your hand.
So, sir, in your proposed rule, where do we have these exceptions rightly stated in the rule?
It's not there currently.
And are you able to provide a proposed statement to this effect?
I believe we could do that.
And I will appreciate that. So down in your number 11, still page 11, you said, including a current and complete wellbore diagram, you went on and on to describe some of the logs that, and it's just some of the logs that has been suggested here. So my question to you is it a recommendation or a requirement?
It's a, for example, these would be the kinds of information that need to be evaluated or that the division may want to look at. Any other information the division determines appropriate to include, current, complete, etc.
So would there be any problem if we just terminate that statement at the division determines appropriate?
Suppose you could do that, but I think it gives guidance if you list some of the typical things that would be expected by the division.
Yeah, but it's just an example. It's not exhaustive. So even it's still at the discretion of OCD. Is that correct?
It's going to be at their discretion. I mean, the operator can come with whatever pile of evidence they have, and OCD may ask for more or say this is plenty. It's up to them.
So let's go to page number 12 of your direct, the slides. So if I read from the last four, so you said the operator has adequate monitoring procedures in place to ensure such requirements will be met. And my comment on that is that I do appreciate that provision, which is really great, at least to keep the operators in compliance, which I appreciate that. Now, when you go to the last one, you said an extended term shall not exceed 2 years, upon which time the operator shall return the well to a beneficial use under a plan the division approves, or permanently plug and abandon the well and restore and remediate the location. So my question is the same thing back to the tertiary, or let's say the secondary, but I do appreciate that you are willing to at least provide some guidance to the commission with regards to a statement to really take care of that. So I think you've already answered that. So let me proceed. So on your slide number 13, I just want to ask, so you've provided, a typical life cycle of a well, and then you're saying that probably after 8 years, there's probably not going to be anything done with the well. I want to ask, this information that you are providing to the commission as part of your testimony, was this based on a typical entire production cycle analysis on an actual oil field?
To my knowledge, yes.
Then why is it not capturing the, let's say, the secondary and then the tertiary recovery process? Because most of, let's say, then let me back up. So, but does this also account for, let's say, some operations that might have occurred in secondary or tertiary?
It's my understanding that this is all inclusive of any well operation. This data was pulled together from OCD data off the website. Can I look at this bar graph and determine whether some of this is EOR or not? No, I can't.
Thank you, sir. So there was a discussion about 95% of all wells plugged in the state are mostly done by operators. So my question to you is that for such an important issue, don't you believe that the commission should hold highly of the proposed changes that the industry folks are making?
Yes.
So I do appreciate your time. I do not have any further questions for you. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Other commission questions?
All right. Thank you, Madam Hearing Examiner. Good afternoon, Mr. Alexander. Yeah, just a threshold question here. I think there might have been some surprise about the new language in Exhibit 72E. Is the proposal from the applicants now based on your conversations or your negotiations with Oxy? Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. So, okay. I think a threshold question, and I don't know, Mr. Alexander, if you're the person to answer this based on some of the questions we heard from Mr. Rankin. But one thing that I'm very interested in hearing across the course of testimony over the coming days or weeks is, where does the OCC hang its hat in terms of authority during this process? I think looking at correlative rights and relationships to financial assurances could be a stretch. I saw in Mr. Tremaine's reply to the motion to dismiss that public health and the environment are certainly one of our charges here at the OCC. But again, any thoughts about how this relates to our charge to prevent waste?
I don't think that I'm really the right person to ask that. That's get into statutory and legal and legislative issues that I'm not prepared to address.
I'll hold that for later and come back to it in the future. One thing that would occur to me would be, no, I'll hold on that. All right, Mr. Eisen, let's just review the big picture again. So you found some 74,500 wells in New Mexico on state and fee lands, correct?
I didn't. The person with EDF that pulled this data together.
Okay, that was part of your testimony, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. And if this rule is proposed now went into effect, how many wells at this time would have to bond at $150,000 each? Do you know?
I don't know the specific answer to that. I'm sorry.
Okay. Looking at your Exhibit 13, which my colleague Commissioner Ampoma just was looking at as well and asking you about.
Yep. Got it.
I believe those are just wells that are not in production, correct?
Correct.
Okay, so that they would not include any wells that were, I guess they could be wells not in production, they're in secondary units, for example.
It could
right?
be.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, so at 8 years, you have 99.5% of inactive wells won't return to production, correct?
Have returned.
Sorry?
Have returned.
Yeah, I'm sorry,
0.5%
99.5% of wells.
Probably, won't.
Mhm. Okay. It's 6 years, that's 98.5%, right?
1.5 won't,
Yeah.
yeah.
How did you arrive at that? I mean, why not have a 6-year limit here versus 8? How did you come to that 8-year number?
Well, we just thought it was a reasonable cutoff, to be honest with you.
Okay.
Now, and if you think about the 6-year point, what does that entail? That entails 1 year of inactivity. And then plus or minus 2 or 3 months where the operator has the opportunity to apply for T&A. And then we stuck with the increments that New Mexico already has, 5-year increments for TA. So then you get 6 years. So what's happening after 6 years? And you take a look at the data as it plots out. Well, gee, only about 1.5% of the wells at this point and beyond ever reactivate. That's a pretty low number. And rather than just stopping it at 5 years, we extended it for another 2. And it's even a more compelling argument that at that point, it's highly likely that the wells will not be reactivated. Now, I'm not saying that I know that whatever percentage of that 0.5% is EOR. Some of those may be even beyond. And we've discussed that at length about principles for a potential extension. Okay.
Thank you.
Uh-huh.
I was going to ask you about that provision at 1915-25-9D about giving operators 30 days to submit an application for administrative review. Commissioner Ampoma asked you about that as well. Could this be 90 days, which is often typical? And I believe you said that you were okay with that.
Yes, sir.
Okay. I would agree with that. Ms. Fox, I couldn't find it. Could anybody pull up the language about speculation?
It's in the definition of beneficial use in 1915 too.
I actually have it on my screen. I'm happy to share.
You could, thank you. Oh, there it is. Thank you.
I think this is what you're talking about.
Yes. There's been a good bit written and what I've read about some issues with speculative purposes, that could be unclear. If we ended this definition after the word monitoring, would this still work for the applicants? And I know you can ask this again in the future if people have had, give some people some time to think about it, but
What we want to guard against, and in some of the testimony from Namoga and IPAM, and I don't remember exactly who, but, the notion that, there's yet to be discovered technologies. There's ideas that nobody's thought about. I get that, but if you don't have some fence around this, then you're going to wind up having a bunch of wells out there that are just waiting for, as I put it earlier, some widget to come down the road in 20 years. And you'd have just a mess. And the longer these wells are in an inactive state and not, for example, part of a viable EOR project going from primary to secondary and tertiary, what's going to likely happen? These wells and the operators are likely, they may become less and less able to take care of their financial responsibilities. So I really think it's important. We think it's important to stick with this.
Okay.
Now, if speculative purposes needs a definition, let's get after it.
thank you. Mr. President, I think this will be a question for somebody else, but one of, I think it was IPAN's witnesses had the question, why not allow a bond to be dropped if a well leaves marginal status? Why require that well to be to remain bonded? Perhaps it has to do with it being uncancelable, but do you have any thoughts on that?
I'm not the one to ask. I'm not the expert in that.
Okay.
Sorry.
Yep. And just a bit of information I was looking for, and I think this might be a question for someone else as well, maybe the OCD if no one else knows, but if an operator has, say, 8 bonds, but one well cannot be P&A'd for that $150,000, can other of the operator's bonds be taken to help with the cleanup of the first well?
I'm not the expert on that. There's someone following me that can answer that.
Very good.
I think.
All right. Those are all my questions. Thank you, Mr. Alexander.
Thank you. Anything further from the commissioners? No? Right. Let's take a break before we resume the technical case and come back around a little before 3:30. for a short break. And as I understand it, Namoga would like to offer its opening statement. Again, each party has an opportunity to offer an opening statement. Let me go through the list though first.
We've actually reconsidered and we'd like to actually make it the start of our case in chief instead.
Okay, so let me go through the list first. But thank you for that clarification, Mr. Suazo. So any other party has the opportunity to make an opening statement right now, and or they can reserve until immediately prior to the presentation of their own witnesses. So, Mr. Tremaine, would you like to offer an opening statement at this time?
Madam Hearing Officer, we will wait until directly before our case in chief.
Thank you. Mr. Moore for the State Land Office.
Madam Hearing Officer, we will also wait until the presentation of our case in chief.
All right, thank you. Mr. Rankin for Oxy.
We'll reserve. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Suazo for Namoka has already said reserve, and Ms. Bradfute, let's see, no, sorry, IPA and Mr. Cloutier.
Thank you, Madam Hearing Officer. We're going to reserve as well.
All right, and Ms. Bradfute.
Thank you, Madam Hearing Officer. We will not be making an opening statement.
I just realized that. So thank you very much. All right, let's return then to Ms. Fox and her next witness.
Applicants will call Dwayne Purvis to the stand.
All right, thank you. Mr. Purvis, if you would spell your first and last name.
Thank you. My name is Dwayne Purvis, DWAYNE PURVIS.
Do you swear or affirm to tell the truth?
I do.
Thank you very much. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Purvis. Thanks for being here. My name is Matt Nykiel, counsel for applicants. Did you submit direct testimony in this matter, applicants exhibit 30?
Yes, I did.
And is your testimony accurate to the best of your knowledge, and do you adopt it?
Yes, I do.
What is your current employment?
I am principal advisor and founder of Purvis Energy Advisors.
What is your educational background?
I earned a Bachelor of Science degree in petroleum engineering from Texas A&M, class of 1994, whoop. Spent a year of study abroad, and then in 2023, I graduated from Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies with a degree in sustainable energy.
And you're a registered professional engineer in Texas, correct?
That's correct.
Can you please describe your work background?
When I started work in 95, I worked for a major third-party reserves engineering firm called Cawley Gillespie. 3 years later, I was partner. 3 years later, the firm split. I co-founded the Strickland Group, where we offered consulting services to oil and gas operators, owners, investors, federal governments, and litigants. I spent 2 years working as the head of reservoir engineering for a large private company in Fort Worth. And then I founded my present firm where I've continued my consulting practice.
Your curriculum vitae is applicants exhibit 29.
Yes, it is.
And is it accurate?
One error, as I wrote in my testimony, I am no longer a professor at Texas Christian University.
You developed a lot of data, charts, graphics in support of your testimony. In general terms, can you please tell the commission how you went about developing that data?
Sure. Data is the raw material for a reservoir engineer like me. At the beginning of the assignment, I collected all the information I could from all the sources I could find, including I looked at New Mexico Tech, I looked at the OCD, I looked at the Legislative Finance Committee, did general web searches, made calls, used the OCD interface, and I used also a data vendor. So I collected all the data I could, also tried public investor presentations to collect all the information I could to build a case one way or the other.
Okay. Do you have any changes or additions to make to your direct testimony or exhibits?
No.
Okay. Mr. Purvis, would you please provide a summary of your direct testimony?
Certainly. So my discipline is reservoir engineering, which is concerned with the strategic direction of an oil company. The job of a reservoir engineer is primarily how much is going to be produced in the future, how can we produce more, and how much is it worth? And that's the work I've done for 30 years for small and large companies. And my testimony here is to try to apply those skills to the issue facing the commission. What I'm going to do first is outline the overall structure, the architecture of the issue, then the nature of the industry in New Mexico from a statistical standpoint, then a way to think about the issue of paying for decommissioning. Then we'll talk about the specifics of the proposal and how they apply to the situation in New Mexico. So I'm showing now applicant's exhibit 30, which is a schematic of the full scope of decommissioning. We often talk about plugging and abandonment, but technically speaking, plugging is a downhole process. The full process of decommissioning involves surface removal of equipment, remediation of pollution, and restoration back to native conditions in all parts of New Mexico. And there's one layer of work for that defined scope. That defined scope includes much more than, but does include the downhole work of plugging, which is the subject of the rulemaking. There's a second layer, though, that must be considered, and that is contingency. These are the known unknowns. It's the nature of a project like this that we will see significant overruns in a minority of the cases that will move the average to something higher than the mean and higher than the mode of a distribution. Fully normal, fully to be expected. And then after a well is plugged, a site decommissioned, there continue to be possible costs associated with a legacy liability. A company, in my experience, retains liability for anything that might be discovered to be in error, be a problem in the future, such as is happening across the border to the south at Antina Ranch, for example, now. So the contingency, the full scope, tends to be multiples of the cost of the downhole work alone. This graphic is a combination of applicants exhibit 31 and 32, shows a map of the state with plugged wells shown in gray, unplugged wells in colors, and a count of the wells. Approximately 63,000 wells stand today unplugged in the state of New Mexico. Two very minor basins, but the vast majority of the wells reside in the Permian Basin or the San Juan Basin. About 2/3, 1/3, except that when we consider federal lands to which these rules do not apply, about 71% of the wells affected by the financial assurance requirements fall in the Permian Basin. As you see in the lower right in the bar chart, I've color-coded and grouped wells by their production rate. And by far, the largest well count in the state are stripper wells. There's a large disconnect between the number of wells and the production that they contribute. This graphic puts in context the total cost that the state and the commission need to consider. This is the work published in March of 2021 by an environmental contractor called Vertex Resources for the state land office. And they calculated over $20 billion worth of liability related to midstream, but more to the point, $22 billion of upstream liability, which will come due for the infrastructure as it exists today in the state of New Mexico. Now, 12.5 billion of that is on federal lands and subject in first order to a different set of rules. But 9.8 billion is the liability that falls directly to the commission. But only 2.4 billion of that is subject to the rulemaking today, which is to say the scope of what the commission and the state need to consider is much broader. But what's at risk right now, what the commission needs to manage is a liability that was measured at $2.4 billion, with a 50% probability being greater 5 years ago before significant inflation. And this next graphic is applicant's exhibit 39, and it shows the context of what's been happening in the world of decommissioning and how costs have been changing. All of this data comes from publications that have data from the OCD. So it's information prepared by the OCD about the costs that they are incurring as they're plugging wells. And what we see is a dramatic increase. I've seen this in reports I've published other places. It's not surprising, but it is meaningful. The red line with the dashes for markers represents the range of single well plugging costs as analyzed by Vertex in 2021, which is to say Vertex's estimate in 2021 of the per well costs of downhole plugging were significantly higher than the actual observed per well cost by OCD. But all evidence points to significant increase in time over those costs, Now, to look a little bit more closely at what's going on in New Mexico, this applicant's exhibit 33 breaks the production in the state down into 6 more homogeneous categories, 4 basins, and within the 2 major basins, vertical separate from horizontal. And it shows the same data in all 4 graphs, but on different y-axis scales. On the top left, we have the largest scale. And what looks like a rocket taking off is the production of oil from horizontal wells in the Permian Basin. It has risen dramatically and quickly and now constitutes 89% of the production in the state. On the upper right, I've zoomed in to about 1/6 of the scale, and now we can begin to see the nature of the next 2 largest groupings, vertical wells in San Juan and vertical wells in the Permian. What we observe importantly is that they peaked over 20 years ago. The basins began exploration and production many decades before, but they peaked more than 20 years ago. They are now producing at rates in aggregate about 20% of their peak. They are continuing to decline, and each one constitutes only about 4% of production in the state. Lower left zooms in again, where we can see in the orange color or brown color, the horizontal wells in the San Juan Basin, which do show some interesting increases, significant increases in the last couple of years. To put those in context, you can look at the same line on the previous 2 graphs and see that what is significant for that subcategory is insignificant in the grand total. And then for the minor basins, you see many years and significant overall decline. So the shale revolution, as it was described before, represented the opening of a new class of resources. There is no more shale revolution to be had because there is no more class of resources like that. Instead, what we see are 2 life cycles occurring. First, the primary production. I won't call it unconventional because most of the San Juan Basin falls under the category of unconventional, but call it vertical instead, and the new horizontal. The older legacy production is deep into its life cycle. It is not a steady state system. It's instead a non-renewable resource that depletes, declines, and ultimately dies. Now, inside this ecosystem of producing companies, we have widely divergent strategies, operating companies of very different nature. This graphic, Exhibit 35, measures those differences on 4 different dimensions. First, It divides every operating company in the state into one bin or the other on two dimensions. From left to right, based on the number of unplugged wells for which the company is responsible. From front to back, whether or not that company is focused more on vertical wells in the front or horizontal wells in the back. So the different strategies and different sizes are represented in different places on the bar chart. Now, in the upper left-hand quadrant, the height of the bar corresponds to the number of legal entities that exist. And by far, the largest number of companies in the state have fewer than 100 wells. And I've divided this into 0 to 10 or 1 to 10, 10 to 100, and then at the far end, more than 500 wells. I figure by the time a company has more than 500 wells, it's clearly a sophisticated company. In the upper right-hand quadrant, the height of the bar measures instead the number of unplugged wells. Every company is represented in the same bin, but instead of totaling the number of legal entities, I've totaled the number of unplugged wells, which is a proxy for the plugging liability. And what we see is that the bulk of the plugging liability, the decommissioning liability, lies in large companies focused on vertical wells. In the lower right, the height of the bar corresponds to the volume of daily production in recent time periods. Here we see that production in the state is dominated by companies dominated by for horizontal wells. There is some production certainly associated with all of the bars, but the largest portion of production is not in the same place. It's not in the same companies, it's not in the same portfolios as the largest concentration of liabilities. Now we move to the lower left, and this shows the recent new production. That is to say, the new drilling. And 99.8% of all new production as measured by peak rate over the last 5 years has come from horizontal wells. And companies fewer than 10 wells have contributed 0.05% of new production, which is to say that the new production, the new drilling, is even more concentrated in large horizontal companies than liabilities or than production. So the system, the industry in New Mexico is so heterogeneous that you cannot assume that the number of companies affected translates to the amount of volume affected or any other dimension. For ease of comparison, Exhibit 36 from applicants subtotals the same information, but only on one dimension. So that it uses the same 4 measures of significance: number of companies, unplugged wells, current production and recent production adds, new drilling. The colors correspond to the nature of the portfolios as in the last exhibit. Less than 20% of wells being vertical or being horizontal is represented in brown, and fewer than 20% vertical are represented in purple. And again, a tremendous disparity. 89% of companies are dominated by vertical wells, and they bear responsibility for 73% of wells to be plugged, but they are contributing only 16% of production and only 1.9% of recent production additions. So this is companies of all size, just of that nature. The next exhibit, 37, looks at subtotals the information by size. We're looking again at number of companies, unplugged wells, production and recent production. But the companies are divided into 10 divisions by percentile rank based on their production volume in this case, not their unplugged wells. And the disparity by size is more apparent here. The top 10% of companies in the state by production account for 97.5% of production and 99.7% of new production. So to the extent that the commission is concerned about maintaining production from the state, the vast majority of the issue is the top 10% of the companies. This graphic, Applicants Exhibit 38, offers a way to begin to think about the issue of the $9.8 billion of decommissioning that are concentrated in companies with very low producing wells. The graphic shows a schematic cash flow from an example project published by the Society of Petroleum Engineers for the purpose of understanding the application of reserve definitions and economic evaluation criteria. Each bar represents a cash flow, negative or positive. I have added the colors and the labels. And of course, the cash flow here is smooth, indicating a smooth price, and price does oscillate, but functionally, this is in a schematic form, this is what happens. We invest at the beginning, we get our money back, we start earning new money. We cruise through a long period of production. At the end of life, we have a big lump sum that comes due. At some point in life, there comes a time when the undiscounted cash flow that's remaining in that project, whether it be a well or a lease or a field or in the whole company, becomes equal to the asset retirement obligation that's due at the end of life. When we evaluate projects, and indeed when we operate projects, we push those costs out into the future as late as possible. There's no economic incentive to bury your money in the ground. But because all of those costs are pushed out farther in life than all of the income, then the discount rate reduces the appearance, the present value of those hard legal, moral, ethical obligations more than they reduce all of the uncertain cash flow that's projected to be earned. So there's a point in time when the remaining cash flow is equal to the remaining obligation, and at that point in time, the net present value will always be positive. In this example, you've got 13 years of life left to operate. Now, thin production, very small, especially at the end by comparison to early life. But the cash flow in this example, $600,000 a month. Net present value is $25 million, 13 years of life. But if you paid $25 million to purchase this field, then you would get your $25 million back. You'd get back another $12 million in profit, and then you turn around and pay $37 million. And at the end of the day, you would have traded your dollars, except that you would have paid out more than you got in. Or at that point in time, paid out exactly what you got in. Right? At the end of the day, you have no more dollars than you had at the beginning. Now, the Petroleum Resource Management System, published by the Society of Petroleum Engineers, recognizes that in an economic evaluation, in this condition, when the undiscounted remaining cash flow is not positive, then the project is not economic as they define it. And if it's not economic, it's not commercial. It is economically recoverable. It makes economic sense to operate each month when I'm still making a profit. But in aggregate, at that point, it's even, and at every point after that, the project's in an upside down condition. But no doubt about it, the project's worth most at the beginning, and it's worth negative at the cost of decommissioning at the end. There's a break point here in the middle that I identified and called holdback as a useful yardstick to understand how and when the risk becomes especially significant. Now, it's true that orphaning occurs at a portfolio level, not at a well level. But any one well that's past the point of holdback is in aggregate a net cost on an undiscounted basis through its life. Therefore, it's a drag on the portfolio. It is an incremental risk. And a portfolio concentrated in late life wells is an especially risky proposition. Historically, the industry has plugged wells and they've paid it out of cash flow that has been from other wells, sometimes reinvesting. But as I showed in the previous slides, there is one group of companies that are focused on drilling, and there's a separate group of companies that are focused on depleting. Those are separate portfolios. There is some reinvestment, some attempts to abate the decline, but a late life strategy is primarily an operational strategy meant to generate returns and give yield to investors. The money is leaving the company, not being reinvested. With that framework of what's going on at a large scale, let's look at the proposals that are offered. And my focus is on these terms, the change in financial assurance related to current wells, and then some about the plans for transfers. Summary here, but let me walk through each one with a little bit more detail. First, I'll note that there is a change in the blanket bonding status, that change is the more important change is the change to individual well financial assurance and then to portfolio level financial assurance. So the changes create 3 breakpoints. One around a defined term of marginal. We must discriminate the defined marginal from the generic meaning of the word marginal, because as I'll show you in a minute, the defined term is much more conservative than in fact the general meaning. The second breakpoint that's created is no beneficial use. The third breakpoint or series of breakpoints has to do with temporary abandonment. At each one of those junctures that are created, the operators have choices about what they're going to do. Continue, improve production, go into temporary abandonment status, or plug. Historically, there were not the same breakpoints. The first term is to change the overall blanket bonding so that 150,000 is required for a company of 1 well, and there are plenty of those. I'm not sure company is the right term, maybe hobbyists, but any entity with 2 wells or more gets $250,000. So it's not much to those tiers. But then we get into the new breakpoints that are created. When a well is classified as marginal under 2 criteria, then it must put up additional financial assurance. Similarly, it creates a category called no beneficial use, again with a dual criteria, both of which must be met. And then finally, temporary abandonment. And on all of these slides, what you see highlighted in yellow represents the changes made in Exhibit 72. The text in red is revision made in 72 or before. So it's the overall revisions. And then again, with approved and expired temporarily abandoned wells. And all of those provisions, as I understand it, don't come into effect until early 2028, which provides 3 years between the time of notice and the time of implementation, at least 2 years. So then, blah, 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 blah. Who's trying to transcribe? So then the question to me becomes, to what do these new breakpoints, do these new terms apply? And I have a series of exhibits to explain what they apply to. The first is Applicant's Exhibit 40. What I've shown here is a cross plot of every well in the state of New Mexico that has 12 months of production or injection during calendar year 2024. On the x-axis is the first criterion, the number of days reportedly active, and on the y-axis, the volume of hydrocarbons reportedly produced. Now that y-axis is a logarithmic scale covering 6 orders of magnitude, so it's extremely broad. But I've color-coded the areas to which the terms apply. The defined term marginal would, at the end of 2024, apply to 2,200 wells. Defined no beneficial use would apply to 1,700 wells. And there are other wells that are not active. So it's a minority of the wells affected by these single well breakpoints. It's hard to see the proportions in this exhibit because so many of the points overprint. But this graphic, Exhibit 40, shows the same information where the area corresponds to the number of wells affected. The wells that are not affected represent 99.95% of production in the state. But it represents only about 89% of the wells. So it affects about 11% of the wells, but a vanishingly small percentage of production. That is not to say that the state does not have very many marginal wells in the general meaning of that term, as I demonstrated on my earlier slide that showed the proportion of wells in stripper status. If I break down the wells that are not affected by the single well assurance, by their rates, we see that over half the wells in the state are already in stripper status, but are not affected by the single well rules. But many of those are not affected by the single well rules.
Mr. Tisdale, I'm sorry, and Mr. Purvis, for the interruption. We had said we would break at 4 to accept public comment. And I don't want to interrupt your train of thought.
This is a fine place.
Okay, thank you very much. And you can wait there to see if we have anyone in the room who's going to offer public comment. Let me, though, call first on the two persons who signed up ahead of time for the public comment session here. Just a few things about public comment. We are making a transcript, so I will ask you to spell your first and last name. The commission rules provide that comment and testimony be provided under oath, so I will ask you to swear or affirm that what you'll say is true. Please collect your thoughts. I can invite your oral comment only once, it should be limited to 3 minutes. If you have more to say than can fit into 3 minutes, you have a couple of weeks really to submit written public comment, which will be weighed the same. You would send that to Sheila Apodaca, the commission administrator. So the two folks who signed up early for a spot here are Marlene Parrott, sister Marlene, and Joan Brown, also sister Joan. Are you in the room or online?
Joan Brown is online, but she will need to unmute herself. I've given her permission.
Oh, thank you. Would you unmute yourself, please? Joan Brown, you have permission to unmute yourself. I can see you on the camera. Now just hit your microphone.
Oh, okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
Okay.
Thank you.
Just so you know, it doesn't work by just clicking the microphone. It didn't. I had to do Control-Shift-M.
Thank you very
So
much
it was
for that.
a little cumbersome there.
Okay, thank you. I'll try to mention that to future commenters. So if you would please spell your first and last name.
Yes, Joan, Joan, Brown, Brown.
Thank you. And do swear or affirm to tell the truth?
I affirm, yes.
All right, thank you. I will start your time.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chair and Commissioners. I am Joan Brown, and I'm a Franciscan sister, and I'm a community advocate with New Mexico and El Paso Interfaith Power and Light. I live in Albuquerque, but I have been to the Permian Basin, working with communities there for well over a decade, under my previous role as Executive Director of Interfaith Power and Light. And we started doing that because of concerns for people's health and just the magnitude of the oil and gas, and as people of faith, concern for care of our sacred land, water, air, and climate, and the future. I'm here today in strong support for bonding and cleanup rule changes, which actually should have been done long ago, considering that so far New Mexicans have already spent nearly $100 million of public funds to plug abandoned oil and gas wells just in the last 5 years. And this is not fair, and it is immoral. I just was recently to Loco Hills in the Permian Basin on one of the immersion retreat experiences that we do. And we were in Loco Hills, and without even looking, we came across a lot of abandoned equipment. We even came to a new oil leak in an old pipe that apparently had been fixed and fixed again and was leaking and leaking. So right now, the oil and gas corporations can drill dozens or even hundreds of wells in New Mexico while posting bonds that cover only a fraction of the cost. And this is a concern. The Legislative Finance Committee found plugging to cost an average of $163,000 per well, and some cost over $700,000. And I had heard previously from someone with OCD that they had spent $1 million on one. The natural resources here belong to us all. When we let oil and gas corporations make millions from wells in our state, they have a responsibility as a business to clean up the wells, to prevent leaks to our drinking water and methane pollution that harms our health, air quality, and is a contributor to climate change. We can't afford to underfund risk, especially when the cost of inaction falls upon our communities. Pope Leo XIV recently said, nature itself is reduced at times to a bargaining chip, a commodity to be bartered for economic or political gain. My concern as a woman of faith comes from an ethical and moral stance to care for our sacred land, water, air, communities, and the future. We, our lands, water, air, and our communities are not commodities to be used what is wanted, to be left a mess, to be dirty, and then to abandoned. We all know there are ways to take care of this immense and growing problem of abandoned and orphaned wells in our state. We just need to be leaders enough to do what is right, no matter what criticism might come from certain political entities or from certain companies or industries. We cannot be bargaining chips. 80% of New Mexicans support strong leadership on these actions. So I thank you for your serious discernment and consideration of all these facts, and that you might choose the common good and the ethical and moral action on this growing and immense issue in our state. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, sister. Sheila, is Sister Marlene on the platform?
I don't see her on here.
All right. If she joins us for another public comment or reaches out, otherwise I'd be happy to accept it. There's an LS on the platform. Larry, let's see, Larry Scott. Mr. Scott, can you unmute yourself?
Yeah, thank you, Madam Examiner, for the opportunity to speak. I am State Senator Larry Scott from District 42.
Oh, thank you very much. Would you, I believe your name is spelled LARRYSCOTT?
That is exactly correct. Thank you, Madam.
And do you swear or affirm to tell the truth?
I do, in fact, so swear.
Thank you. Go ahead, Senator.
Okay. I have some fairly significant personal experience with this subject matter. I spent the better part of 40 years as one of the very smallest independent oil and gas producers, almost exclusively in southeast New Mexico, in Lee and Eddy counties. At one point, our little company was managing, I think, close to 60 wells, counting producers and injectors. And I can assure you that all of these calculations that I am listening to do not take into account having to set aside, if you will, $150,000 per marginal well as effectively unproductive capital. That process would have driven me to bankruptcy in fairly short order. Now, in full disclosure, I'm no longer an operator. I still maintain interest as a non-operator in a number of properties, but all of my obligations to the state of New Mexico have been fulfilled, and plugging obligations and those bonds have been released. I have serious concerns. I've been in the legislature long enough to have participated in the legislation that increased the blanket bonding requirements from 50,000 to 5x of that at 250,000. I'm not aware that that's had any significant impact, either plus or minus, on the obligations of the state, or any plus or minus impact on small operators in the state. Now, let's talk about the reclamation fund. Our oil and gas producers over the years have paid millions of dollars into that reclamation fund that have been misappropriated for use, in many cases, swept when New Mexico was short of funds, and not utilized for the intended purpose of overcoming the very few operators that have failed to fulfill their plug and abandonment operations. I think the increase in bonding requirements that was affected in 2018 was affected after robust debate and votes by both the House and the Senate. And this proposal needs to be vetted through that process rather than as a rulemaking. Thank you, Madam Examiner, for the opportunity to comment, and I'll look forward to the rest of the testimony. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Senator Scott. Is there anyone else on the platform who would like to offer public comment during this public comment session? There will be many more opportunities, 9 o'clock and 4 o'clock every day of the hearing. And I forgot to mention, if you have dialed in using a phone, you can use *5 to unmute yourself. And if you would like to offer your comment in Spanish, we do have an interpreter present. This is one of the 4 sessions in which we have an interpreter present to interpret between English and Spanish and English. Anyone else on the platform? No? All right. Let me ask if there's anyone in the room who would like to offer public comment during this session. Oh, all right. Well, thank you all very much. And our next public comment session will be 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. And the next public comment session, in which there will be Spanish language translation, will be 4:00 tomorrow afternoon. We'll return now to the technical case and continue with Mr. Purvis's testimony. Mr. Tisdale.
Excuse me, Mr. Nykiel. That's okay. No
I'm
worries.
very sorry. Mr. Nykiel.
Mr. Purvis, please continue your summary, direct.
Exhibit 43, shown on the screen, begins a new line of analysis. The question here is whether or not a well that qualifies under the definition of marginal is in fact marginal in the general meaning of that term. The general meaning, of course, being that it's not making much money. It is making money, but not much. So I examined empirically the rate at which wells ceased to produce in the last 15 years. This graphic is set up in the same way as the previous graphic, but it shows a population of thousands of wells that empirically have ended their lives in the last 15 years. The same x-axis, the same y-axis, the same regions colored. And what I observe is, of course, that the large majority of wells cease being marginal and become economic at rates known empirically to be above the threshold defined for the increased financial assurance. This next exhibit shows that a little bit more quantitatively. Exhibit 44 shows for each year the wells which empirically ended their life, whether at the point of the end of their life they qualified for as no beneficial use as proposed, whether they qualified as marginal as proposed, and whether they qualified for neither. And what we see is that on average over the last 15 years, nearly 60% of wells that have ended, left the domain of marginal and become uneconomic have not begun to qualify for increased financial assurance, which is to say that the terms, the breakpoints as defined to require additional financial assurance are conservative. As you saw on my exhibit about holdback, and as you know, the profitability of a well can be low for a long period of time. The wells that ended here probably were in marginal status without protection for many years. Exhibit 45 shows a way to look at the complement of that data set. These are wells that are not yet plugged. I've broken the wells in the state down into the same 6 categories: 4 basins, horizontal and vertical. And I've created a type of graphic here that we can call a peloton graph for easy reference. And it's intended to show how the bulk of wells progress through their life cycle to the end of life. On the x-axis is I should say first, each bar represents a 12-month average rate of the wells. It's a histogram, but I've divided up those bars and positioned them in a graph. Along the x-axis is the average age of wells in that bin, and on the y-axis, the range of rates that bin covers. So what we see is an average trajectory of, in this case, all of the horizontal and directional wells in the Permian Basin. And you see that the large majority of the wells are, in fact, young. The peloton, the bulk of the bars are on the order of 5 years old. But we can see the path that older wells have taken and where they stand in their life cycle. Now, the bottom part of the graph, colored in gray, filled in gray, represents stripper wells. And what we see from this graph is that we can expect, what it implies is the average life of horizontal wells are on the order of 15 years. And this is not inconsistent with the studies I've made in the Barnett Shale and Marcellus, Fayetteville, India, a number of other shales. A very high initial rate, quick depletion, short life. These wells are not currently at financial risk. They are still producing at high rates. They will deplete quickly and enter a condition of stripper status. But this graph shows more to the point, a much larger data set, 22,000 wells of the vertical wells in the Permian Basin. Of those 22,000, only 113 wells are currently producing more than 100 barrels a day on average. Instead, the large majority of wells are stripper wells. They have progressed deep into their life and are in the vicinity of the end of their economic life. And this was say before about the inherent life cycle of a basin. What you see color coded in purple are those wells affected by the criteria of no beneficial use, and in blue, the wells affected by the definition of marginal, which are clearly still a subset. Now, to put these rates in context, let's look at Exhibit 47. I've overlain here the statistical information about the last 15 years of wells which have empirically died. Looking only at the one criteria, the last 12 months production. Now, one of IPAM's witnesses testified that sometimes a vertical well in the Permian Basin could produce as low as 2 barrels a day and still make money. And what we see here is that 75% of the wells that ended their life did produce lower than that, which suggests, on the one hand, it's possible that very many wells have been operated below economic limit. But we see that 90% of the wells that have ended their life have ended below 5 barrels a day, and that the large majority of the 22,000 vertical wells in the Permian Basin are within the window of the end of their economic life, as demonstrated by historical performance. That same kind of idea, that same dynamic is shown here in the San Juan Basin. The x-axis here has changed because so many of the wells are more than 30 years old. I did not have an accurate average age. But in the San Juan Basin, out of 19,000 wells, there are 9 producing more than 100 barrels a day on average. The bulk are certainly in stripper status, but the peloton, the concentration, are producing a little higher. They continue to deplete. They will approach their economic limit, but the current proposal only affects the purple and the blue, a small minority. This graphic, Exhibit 50, overlays the empirical information on the economic limits of vertical wells in this basin. And we see the numbers turn out to be pretty similar to the average in the Permian. But a very large number of these wells are already in the window, and almost all of them are near the window. Which is to say, again, past is not prologue. There is a large volume of a large liability of decommissioning, plugging, restoration, remediation that will come due in the near future. Now, the proposal from applicants also includes a provision for single well bonding for an entire portfolio in the case of portfolios with more than 15% of the wells that qualify as marginal or inactive. Now, remember, the no beneficial use clause triggers an action that something must be done with the well, not additional financial assurance necessarily. And this is critical to the overall effect of the proposal because the risk is primarily at the portfolio level. So to answer the question of the effect, I looked at the history or the 2024 production of the companies in New Mexico, the ones that reported production. There are additional companies responsible for wells who did not even bother to file a production report. Excluding those, I found the proportion of marginal and idle wells under the proposed definition in each portfolio and created a bar chart of the number of wells in each portfolio. And that's what you see at the top left. There is a clear break in the number of wells at a 15% marker threshold. The majority of wells, the 82% of the wells in the state of New Mexico fall in portfolios with less than 15% marginal or idle wells, or marginal or inactive wells as proposed. But then, of course, there's this long tail. So if we create a breakpoint at a 15% threshold and draw that vertically down through the graph and then look below, these are the same kinds of bar charts as I was showing before. The color corresponds from the top to the bottom. So wells in portfolios of fewer than 5% marginal or inactive are shown in dark brown, fewer than 10%, rather, are shown in dark brown. And what we see is that this threshold criteria separately affects 18% of wells in the state. And it affects 51% of the corporate entities that reported production. But it affects only 2.3% of the statewide BOE production. And of course, the previous analysis showed that in consideration for new production, the percentage would be even smaller. So on the one hand, it does affect a number of legal entities, but it affects fewer wells and very little production. Last in my summary is the proposal of an inflation adjustment. And it's important to note here that this is an option that starts several years from now at the discretion of the OCD. It's proposed that they could implement a formulaic increase in the single well bonding value up from the $150,000 based on the consumer price index. We've demonstrated what we know to be the case. Costs tend to go up, and they have gone up significantly in recent years. There is more than one way to deal with increasing costs. You could hold hearings like in 2018 or 2012 or whatever else. This option is more efficient. The question becomes then how to set the formula. The proposal's consumer price index, which is not obvious, but the formula needs to be something that's available as well as something that's representative. So I have looked at historical inflation in the oil and gas industry. And observed that there are swings up and sometimes down. The best long-term measure is an alternative measure from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the best I found, and that is the oilfield equipment price index. It correlates well to other measures which may or may not be available in the future. And in this graph, Exhibit 53, I've overlain the consumer price index and the oilfield equipment price index at two slightly different anchor points. The point here is not that they're the same. The point is that they trend the same way. There's more volatility in oil and gas, but in the long term, and given the delay, given the availability of data, and given the demonstrative similarity, I think it's a fair solution. Mr. Nykiel, that's the end of what I had prepared to summarize. Is there anything else that I have overlooked?
Thank you for your summary, Mr. Purvis.
Oh. Yeah. I'm sorry. I thought it might have had another exhibit, but
Yep. So, Mr. Purvis, did you submit rebuttal testimony in this matter, applicant's Exhibit 74?
yes, I did.
And do you have any changes or additions to make to your testimony or exhibits?
Yes, I do. On page 55, line 10, the word fewer should be other.
And is your testimony accurate to the best of your knowledge, and do you adopt it as amended?
Yes, I do.
Okay. Would you please provide a summary of your rebuttal testimony?
Thank you for asking. There was a great deal of discussion on a large number of topics. I identified 3 themes that were present, that were of particular importance, and one theme that was absent that I thought was especially important. On the one hand, first, there was a good deal of discussion about what is done or not done in other states, what the costs are in other states. There's a good deal of discussion about how the changes are implemented, how the concepts are implemented, sometimes too rigid, sometimes too flexible, sometimes too uncertain. And there was a good deal of discussion about the cost to the industry and indirectly the cost to the public. But what I did not observe was a comparison of the cost to industry to the cost or the benefits to the public. So if I may, there's a problem, a difficulty in designing policy. On the one hand, it's good to be simple, clear, and efficient to implement. On the other hand, it's also good, beneficial, valuable to be flexible and adaptive. But both of those values also have downsides. They could be called rigid, or they could be called vague, or they could be called burdensome. But the job of the policymaker is to find what is effective. The policy should accomplish its intended purpose, both now and in the future. Whether it's simple or complex is secondary consideration. First issue must always be effectiveness. And to the extent that effectiveness is costly, the question becomes whether the benefit justifies increasing the ability to perform the task. And that's closely related to the second consideration in policy objectives. The goal of the policymaker is the greatest public good. And this is a lot like choosing the spacing between horizontal wells. I can put the wells closer together, I can spend a lot more money, and I can get more oil. But at some point, my economic returns diminish. So I'm going to keep down spacing until I reach a maximum. I'm going to keep adjusting. As long as I have more incremental benefit compared to incremental costs, I'm going to keep dialing until I reach that maximum. So it's not just effective, it's effective for the maximum public good. Now, there was a little bit of discussion from Dr. R. Scott about 2 papers, one by Dotchis and one by Boomhauer. Now, the summaries that he presented, the quotes weren't the most salient in my mind, but it raises a good point that prior literature, prior studies, and experience lay the groundwork for what to expect. This is not dispositive of what will happen in New Mexico. It does, however, set the basis of expectation by relevant analog. And this slide and the next 2 summarize the most important excerpts from a series of papers, which address all 3 of the concerns, the thematic concerns from before. First, what has been done before is systematically failing and not an accurate basis for comparison. Similarly, the costs vary significantly from basin to basin and state to state. And the costs historically before inflation and the costs in other states are not relevant to the determination of this security that the state of New Mexico needs in 2025. Second, it says that one of the papers offers the conclusion that time spent trying to optimize the financial assurance is probably a waste of value. That's not worth the benefit it creates. But most importantly, systematically through these studies, we see that the analysis shows that the changes to financial assurance that have been implemented have been suboptimal. Policies have been biased in favor of production and have created a net loss to social benefit. All that to recommend that a stronger intervention comports better with the established knowledge and science about financial assurance, not science, knowledge. There were some other themes in the direct testimony that merited address, I think. Testimony about alternative models. There certainly are other models for financial assurance in other industries. Those are not before us now. If we were going to create a model from scratch, we might do something different, but that's not the relevant question. And there was a good deal of discussion about risk-based variations and about the data that's available to make the judgments on what the cost should be. Most of the arguments are not something I would characterize as risk-based, but rather cost-based. The question is not so much, the arguments that are being made is not so much whether or not they're likely to be paid, but how much is likely to cost. Now, I'm bearing in mind that the average cost to the state is significantly more than the cost of downhole plugging that's being assured. I looked pervasively, look everywhere I could for costs, and the OCD's information on the cost that they've spent for plugging is by far orders of magnitude better, more complete than anything else that's available. It is the best data to work from. But part of the argument pertains further direct from other experts, has to do with what they call typical or median costs. And this is a question of what point in the distribution you should pick. Dr. Arscott accepts, agrees in his affirmative testimony that we would expect our priority is the nature of cost estimation, that the average will be higher. This is not a normal distribution. It's a skewed right distribution, and the average will be higher than the median and higher than the mode. What is appropriate as financial assurance for a single well, completely on its own? Well, I should say it differently. The median cost is the most, the mode cost is the most likely to be experienced if you're plugging a single well. But if you're plugging a group of wells, whether it's a portfolio of 50 or 60 or a state of 63,000, you will approach the average. It's the nature of the central limits theorem that adding probability distribution converges at the mean. So in the discussion of cost-based issues, there was a proposal, a persistent theme, that it could be tied to depth. And indeed, in the literature, the depth is one of the stronger among the very weak variables. This is an excerpt from the appendix to the primary paper cited by multiple witnesses by Ramey in 2021. This shows 7 orders of magnitude of costs correlated to depth. And this is from multiple states, but still the best data to demonstrate. Even with incorporating the consideration of depth, the costs vary widely. You might be closer on the average, but you still have a very wide variation. In the case of the Ramey study, the first order variable was the state. Their total model, including 5 or 6 variables, gave them a correlation coefficient of 0.67. which is still quite broad. So there's not a situation in which you could incorporate depth and achieve a situation where there's never a number that's too high or too low. This graphic demonstrates the issue of cost overruns and the nature of that uncertainty. Now, this is data that comes from the OCD's experience plugging wells. It's a histogram showing the percentage overrun or underrun of the actual plugging costs by comparison to the estimated costs. In the last few years, costs have changed significantly. So the baseline is moving. But we do have, as a measure of that contingency variable, how much the actual changed. Now, and there were a number of cases in which the estimated cost in the spreadsheet, in the data of the OCD, was clearly not a well-specific data. I've cut that out. This is where we have a clear by well estimate of cost before the work and after the work. And what we see is that the most likely, the mode of the histogram is plus or minus 10%. Well done. There are cases where there's savings, but more significant than I expected, but a large number of cases with overruns up to double in light red and more than double in dark red. The average overrun is 43%. That is affected significantly by one sample. But even if I take that out, it's an average overrun of 25%. So the appropriate way to plan, the appropriate way to ask for financial assurance is to get an average cost. Not every well will go that high, but on average, because we're dealing with more than one well, it will. On some of the other more minor themes, there's a argument about the reduction of working capital and the reduced reinvestment. Empirically, I've demonstrated that reinvestment is very small for the companies most affected. Certainly reinvestment in the form of drilling. The provisions about transfers will certainly reduce the number of transfers that occur. That's the objective. Even several of the witnesses for industry acknowledge that wells are transferred in this condition of marginal profitability. And given what we know about the nature of the life cycle, a well that's barely making money is probably not going to be able to create a lump sum capable of paying for its legal obligations. What's more, transfers have no inherent value. They have value to the extent that a company can and will do something better with the property. But if someone wants to do that, they can provide the necessary financial assurance. If they want to take the risk, then they have the opportunity, and they need to be able to suffer the downside, the loss of that. There is some discussion about innovation. And here the problem starts to become a question of the meaning small or smaller. Companies in New Mexico range from 1 well to 10,000 wells. It's 5 orders of magnitude. So I could say generally that a large company is 10 times as big as a small company, but then I can say that 5 times. So a company of 1 well or 10 wells is certainly small, but a company of 100 or 200 or 500 becomes a question of whether or not you mean small. I consider those not small companies, but by the time you get to several hundred wells, you should be operating in a professional manner. The companies, and a lot of the testimony on both sides has opined that the strategy is cost reduction for the smallest and the latest, the last in the life cycle. And that is not compatible with innovation. They may be ingenious and creative and hardworking and salt of the earth, but that is not the same as genuine innovation. And lastly, there's an argument that the change in rules will drive companies out of the state, with the implication that that state will suffer as a consequence. There is a good deal of literature on the concept of tax competition among states. And that's cited in my testimony. What the literature shows is that tax competition among natural resources is not effective. Oil companies can leave the state, but oil fields cannot. Anyone who wants to develop that property must do so on the terms that New Mexico specifies, and the landowner. Less will be developed in the state only to the extent that the incremental burden changes the returns on a project so that it crosses below the threshold for incremental investment. If a project's producing 45% rate of return, as horizontal drillers have often said in other basins, and you add some sort of layer of burden that decreases the return to 43%, you are not going to change the amount of activity that's performed. If you change the economics so that it goes from 11% to 9%, maybe then that changes what is performed. Maybe another company still thinks it's 11% and they'll do it. Or maybe prices cycle back up, it crosses 11%, the project gets done, crosses 10%, project gets done, and the state is better off for having the project performed and taxes paid at a higher oil price. There was one way that I could examine the consequence or the significance of the number of wells, number of companies operating in New Mexico, and that is applicants Exhibit 80. This graph shows two different sets of data. On the left axis in blue or dark color is the number of wells that produced oil or gas in the state in that year. And the red line shows the percentage decline of well count each year. It's shown against the scale on the right, and it's shown as positive numbers for the net percent exit. And then at individual years, I have labeled the gross number of exits and the gross number of entries to the state of New Mexico. And what we see is that in the last 30 years, the number of companies active in New Mexico has neatly halved. The pace of exits from the state has increased from around 2% to, in 2024, 10%. 57 companies stopped producing in New Mexico in 2024, and only 15 companies entered. All while, in the last 10 years, production has skyrocketed. This is not a dispositive graph, but it is indicative. It breaks the paradigm that more companies are necessarily better. There are still 399 companies for this set of wells in the state. Plenty of companies to seize whatever opportunities remain economically viable. I believe this is my. There was also an assertion that, or I also examined the question of the historical significance of the small companies. So these two graphics are analogous to the bar charts I presented before, but instead of looking at 2024 production, I looked at production since 1993. The top graph ranks the companies in New Mexico by their cumulative production. And what we see is the top 10% of companies have contributed 96.5% of cumulative production. The bottom 90% have contributed 3.5%, which is slightly higher than it was in 2024, but not a significant value still. And the bottom, I've grouped the companies by their absolute size rather than their relative size. The largest companies in dark green and the smallest in brown, gray. And what we see is, again, the bottom 54% of companies made 0.1% of all the oil and gas that's been produced from the state of New Mexico over the last 30 years. Now, there was some discussion in the direct testimony about whether something should be, something might be speculative and what that might mean. And the same issue could apply, same concept applies to the extensions of temporary abandonment status. And what I observed is that there is a basis that the commission could use, a template you could use to define those terms more precisely. The Society of Petroleum Engineers, along with every other major oil and gas organization, endorses the Petroleum Resource Management System, which broadly defines the potential future recovery into three categories: reserves, contingent resources, and prospective resources. Prospective resources, for reference, historically have been called speculative resources or characterized as speculative. These are volumes which are not yet proved to exist. But we have reason to believe that there are fish in the lake. We just haven't proved there are fish in the lake. Most of the time, we spend our energy focused on reserves, but there is this purgatory category called contingent resources, which is usually a temporary no man's land for things that could happen, but we don't know for sure. But the people who have developed the PRMS have developed a detailed set of criteria and categories for these contingent resources based on the technical and economic justification, the willingness and ability of the company, and the feasibility from a practical and regulatory standpoint. Those concepts, indeed those specific categories, could be used by the commission to define the thresholds for no beneficial use, or perhaps for extension of temporary abandonment. If you want more definition, it could be there.
Thank you, Mr. Purvis. Madam Hearing Officer, we could begin his rebuttal testimony, but it would probably take us beyond 5. And so was just curious what you would prefer.
How long do you estimate it?
I'd say roughly 30 minutes.
Oh, all right. I think perhaps we should do that in the morning then. As I understand it, we're not really supposed to be here much past 5, correct, Mr. Chair?
That'd be, yes.
All right. So we will see you tomorrow morning at 9 when we will begin with public comment. Thank you, Mr. Purvis, Mr. Nykia.
Thank you.
Thank you.